September 2006. A damp, cold air enveloped the South Philadelphia neighborhood as the city's demolition crew entered an abandoned house on Tasker Street that had been sealed and forgotten for decades. Work lights swept across thick dust and peeling walls, then paused on an unusually dark patch of brick in the living room. Central, we need to halt all demolition at 1427 Tasker Street and request the Scene Investigation Unit immediately. The supervisor's voice echoed through the empty, dilapidated space. What began as a routine scheduled demolition had suddenly become something entirely different, something that could answer questions haunting South Philadelphia for over 40 years. Behind the freshly broken brick was a rebuilt wall cavity, and inside it lay carefully concealed human remains, along with a small metal keychain bearing the mark of Harrington Steel Works. The keychain Mickey Harrington carried with him the night he vanished in 1964. For nearly half a century, Mickey's disappearance existed only as unanswered questions. A 19-year-old who left Rossi's Market one summer evening and vanished on the familiar walk home. An empty chair at every family meal. A bedroom door that was never closed again. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to subscribe and like the video. Your support helps bring forgotten cases back into the light and ensures you don't miss the next stories. Because the discovery at the Tasker Street house was not just the end of a missing person case. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would expose secrets buried for decades in this small working-class community. When authorities finally zeroed in on a suspect and made an arrest, it wasn't a drifter or an anonymous predator. It was someone the neighborhood knew well, someone they had trusted, someone who had lived among them for 40 years, carrying this horrifying secret. The Harrington case is not just a mystery unearthed. It is proof of a family's unrelenting persistence, of investigators who refused to let the file gather dust, and of forensic science that finally gave voice to a victim silenced for too long. It is also the story of a community fractured. When Mickey vanished in 1964, suspicion spread through the neighborhood like smoldering fire. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Conversations stopped. Looks changed. The search for Mickey Harrington exposed deep cracks beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary block, and those cracks would split wide open when the truth finally emerged after more than 40 years. What makes this case especially haunting is that the answer was never truly far away. The prime suspect had appeared in the initial investigation, but slipped through every crack. For decades, that person continued living an ordinary life, walking the familiar streets, looking straight into the community that had unwittingly sheltered them. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below, because these stories connect us across any distance. Tonight, we go back to 1964 Philadelphia, retracing every minute of the night Mickey Harrington disappeared, following the investigation that was missed for decades, and arriving at the stunning turning point that brought truth to one of this city's most haunting cold cases. This is a story of loss, persistence, years of deception, and justice delayed, but never denied. Philadelphia, summer 1964. South Philadelphia unfolded with its old row houses, narrow streets, dim yellow lights, and the thick atmosphere of a working-class district where every movement carried the quiet imprint of the era. In that setting, Michael Mickey Harrington, 19, a young steelworker at a mill near the Schuylkill River, lived with his family in a small house on Tasker Street, following the familiar rhythm of home to mill and mill to home each night. On the night of July 14, 1964, Mickey finished his shift around 9:05 p.m., walking slowly through the familiar blocks before stopping at Rossi's Market on South 18th Street to pick up a few small items. Around 9:32 p.m., Mickey left the store carrying a small paper bag and headed toward Tasker Street on his usual route, a walk that should have taken only a few minutes through dark alleys and rows of attached houses. But that was the last time anyone in the community saw him. When the clock passed 10:15 p.m., the family began to sense something was wrong. Mickey was never late. By 10:30 p.m., they stepped out onto the front stoop, peering down Tasker Street, hoping to see his familiar figure. But the street was empty, with only distant car sounds and the faint glow of streetlights. At 10:45 p.m., they expanded the search to the small market and the alley Mickey sometimes used as a shortcut, but there was no trace he had passed through. By 11 p.m., after walking the entire usual route and knocking on a few familiar doors, none of whom had seen him after 9:30 p.m., the family had to accept that Mickey's absence was no longer a normal delay. Spontaneous search efforts yielded no signs, and the lengthening gap turned initial worry into clear fear. After checking every nearby possibility with no trace or contact, the family decided to call the police, the last step they hoped would bring answers. The missing person report reached the Philadelphia Police Department's night dispatch around 11:08 p.m., just as the night shift had settled in, and officers were mainly handling minor neighborhood disturbances. Under 1964 procedures, an adult reported missing on the same day was rarely treated as urgent absent signs of violence or specific medical issues. So the desk sergeant initially recorded only basic information: victim's name, age, residence, last seen time, and expected route from Rossi's Market to Tasker Street. However, the family's emphasis that Mickey never stayed out late, his stable habits, and the fact he was only 19 forced the sergeant to classify the case as missing, elevated concern, per internal guidelines for young people, vanishing briefly without signs of running away. An intake report was created at the desk, documenting the report time, informant, and circumstances. From there, the department assigned 2 South Division patrol officers, Officer Granger and Officer Miles, to conduct immediate on-scene verification that night, first to determine if there were signs of criminality or merely a deviation from routine. They were tasked with going to the scene, gathering more details from the family, confirming clothing and items carried, and cross-checking the usual route. A preliminary investigation file was opened with a case number, marking the official start of the search process, along with forms logging developments, initial contacts, and priority survey areas. In the 1964 paper system, all missing person data had to be hand-entered into ledgers, victim demographics log, disappearance time confirmation, and duty assignment slips for each officer. The initial report also noted key area features to check: dark route, low foot traffic, and possible abandoned houses along the path. As Granger and Miles left the station for Tasker Street, Mickey's missing person file was officially activated, becoming a case requiring immediate nighttime verification to determine whether this was a temporary absence or an early sign of something more serious. Minutes after leaving the station and arriving on Tasker Street, the 2 officers immediately took information from the family and moved to verify Mickey's travel route based on 2 key time points. He left Rossi's Market at 9:32 p.m. and never reached home despite a 5 to 7 minute walk. Using the area map and their South Philadelphia patrol experience, they quickly outlined the most logical path from the store. Mickey would cross South 18th Street, enter the narrow stretch leading to Tasker Street, then follow the row houses home. This was the shortest route, with few intersections, and one Mickey used almost daily. The officers started at the origin point, outside Rossi's Market, using the clerk's information that Mickey left with a small paper bag heading southeast. Granger noted each lamppost location, dark gaps between lights, and small alleys connecting to the main path. In 1964, this area still had long stretches of darkness due to limited public lighting, making quiet segments potential high-risk spots. Walking the assumed route, Miles scanned the pavement, stoops, and gaps between attached houses for physical signs: torn bag, scraps of paper, dropped items, scuff marks, or anything out of place. There were no signs of struggle on the ground, no scattered belongings, a detail they noted suggesting that if a third party intervened, it happened swiftly and quietly enough to avoid drawing attention. They continued to the intersection of South 18th and the dark alley leading to Tasker Street, where light was nearly non-existent and visibility was blocked by close brick walls. This was marked as the first high-risk point: poor sightlines, confined space, and 2 side paths leading to rear yards of row houses. Granger measured the alley width, noted transit time through it, and the possibility of someone hiding in shadow undetected. At the alley mouth, they found an open rear yard leading to the northern row, second high-risk point. where individuals could conceal themselves from street view. Miles checked rear doors of nearby houses, confirming many were unlocked, a common feature of old homes at the time, and increasing the chance they could be exploited to approach passers-by. As the officers moved deeper into Tasker Street, they flagged additional unlit sections, gaps between broken lampposts, and shadowed corners created by the entrance to an abandoned house, 1427 Tasker, a building the community had repeatedly reported as a hangout for transients. The building's front was completely dark, its wooden door cracked, and exterior walls showed signs of makeshift past repairs. This was recorded as the highest risk point along the entire route. After documenting anomalies, Granger and Miles prioritized 3 areas for deeper follow-up survey. First, the alley connecting South 18th to Tasker, the stretch Mickey would have walked in total darkness, with the highest likelihood of ambush or quick approach. Second, rear yards and side paths linking attached houses, locations where someone could be pulled out of sight without notice. And finally, the abandoned house at 1427 Tasker, the most anomalous point on the route, with potential as a hiding or concealment spot for criminal activity. Concluding the survey, they completed a fully marked risk map, including transit times between segments, witness visibility potential, and positions allowing concealment in critical seconds. From this compiled data, Granger wrote an assessment, concluding that Mickey was most likely approached at one of the 3 identified risk points sometime after leaving Rossi's Market and before losing all community contact, and recommended immediate in-shift deep survey of each area. Right after locking down the spatial temporal framework of the event, Granger and Miles moved to the next step in initial investigation protocol, collecting statements from residents within a 3-block radius of Mickey's travel route. They compiled a household list, ordered by proximity to the path, based on neighborhood maps and residency records held at the precinct. The first block to canvass was the row on South 18th Street, where Rossi's Market sat at the corner, and many residents habitually stood on stoops during summer evenings. The second block covered the dark alley connecting South 18th to Tasker Street, fewer occupied homes, but many old houses with rear doors opening to the alley. The third block was Tasker Street itself, where second-floor windows faced directly onto Mickey's Road, and residents could look down on the street during the relevant time frame. The officers divided the area. Granger took South 18th and the initial section of Tasker, while Miles focused on homes near the alley and positions with direct views of the narrow path. From about 11:40 p.m. to midnight, they knocked on doors, asking targeted operational questions: who was on the stoop or near windows between 9:25 and 9:40 p.m.? Did anyone hear unusual noises or see strangers around that time? Did anyone notice any vehicle passing multiple times in a short period? Granger noted many households said they weren't paying close attention, busy watching TV or eating late dinner, but some reported seeing movement on the street around the time Mickey left Rossi's Market. A middle-aged woman on the eastern side of South 18th said she saw Mickey from a distance as he left the store, paper bag in hand, walking normally, but a few steps behind him were 2 tall men in dark clothing, moving more slowly. She couldn't make out their faces, but confirmed the gap between Mickey and the 2 men was no more than half a block. This was the first statement confirming 2 unknown individuals trailing the victim, aligning with the vague description from the Rossi's Market clerk. Miles, meanwhile, obtained a statement from a man living in the house right at the entrance to the dark alley. He said that, while taking out trash around 9:35 p.m., he saw car headlights reflect off brick walls, indicating a vehicle moving slowly from South 18th eastward. When he looked closely, in the dim streetlight, he recognized it as a gray Mercury Monterey, a common model but rarely seen in the area at that hour, given the quiet streets. He noted the car passed, paused briefly at the block corner, then continued slowly in the direction Mickey would have gone. Another Tasker Street resident recalled hearing an engine idling slowly around the same window, then suddenly accelerating as if leaving after a momentary stop. The overlap in timing and vehicle description led Miles to log the gray Mercury Monterey as a vehicle of interest. When compiling statements from the 3 blocks, Granger observed that time references clustered around 9:32 to 9:40 p.m., precisely when Mickey left the store and disappeared. All descriptions converged on two key elements: the appearance of two unknown men following the victim and the unusual presence of a gray Mercury Monterey moving slowly along the route. Critically, no witness reported hearing screams, struggle, or loud sounds, indicating that if contact occurred, it was fast, skillful, and in an out-of-sight area. Granger drafted a preliminary report, categorizing witnesses by observation level, Level 1. Those who directly saw Mickey and the two strangers, Level 2. Those who saw the suspect vehicle, Level 3. Those who heard sounds but lacked sufficient detail. This data was turned into a time-space diagram marking each witness's position, line of sight, and the suspect vehicle's possible path. After completing the canvass, the officers returned to Tasker Street for a final cross-check of intersections between Mickey's route and the likely path of the Mercury, to determine whether the vehicle could have approached the victim in the dark stretch between the alley and the abandoned house. The night's recorded data reinforced the initial assessment. Mickey's disappearance was not a routine deviation or voluntary departure, but directly tied to the appearance of two unidentified individuals and a vehicle present at the critical moment, forming the central investigative focus for the newly activated missing person file. From that foundation, Granger and Miles moved to the next step in the process, an expanded scene search to determine if any additional physical evidence could further narrow the time frame and location of Mickey's disappearance. Since all witness statements centered around the window of 9:32 to 9:40 p.m., they expanded the survey in a fan-shaped pattern, using Rossi's Market as the starting point and Tasker Street as the endpoint, while increasing the search radius from 1 block to a maximum of 5 blocks to avoid missing any evidence that might have been displaced by wind, light rain, or passers-by. The search began at the point where Mickey left the store, where the small market's stoop light was still on, then gradually extended to the opposite sidewalk and the curb area where residents sometimes left household trash bags that could obscure small items. In this zone, Granger checked every crack in the pavement, every gap between stoop steps and curb edges, noting the possibility that Mickey might have accidentally dropped something while walking. Finding no trace, the two officers continued along South 18th Street toward the dark alley leading to Tasker Street. The location witness statements confirmed as the site where two unknown individuals appeared, and a gray Mercury Monterey moved unusually slowly. This alley was considered the pivotal point of the search because it was the intersection between the victim's route and the spot where the suspect vehicle could approach without drawing attention. Miles swept his flashlight across the ground from the alley entrance to its exit, checking depressions in the concrete, faint scratches that might have been caused by a falling object or light impact, and scanning the areas against the brick walls where a paper bag or paper item could easily be blown by the wind. It was during this sweep that Miles discovered a brown paper bag that was slightly damp but still intact in shape, lying against the left wall edge about 20 meters from the alley entrance. The critical detail was that this bag type matched the ones customers typically received when purchasing items at Rossi's Market, and according to the initial description from the clerk, Mickey had left the store with exactly that kind of paper bag. Granger immediately requested preservation of the evidence in a specialized evidence bag, precisely noting the location, time, and environmental conditions at the moment of discovery. The discovery of the paper bag became evidence item number 1 in the case, and the first milestone that allowed the officers to anchor a physical location to the victim's movement timeline. If Mickey left the store at 9:32 p.m. and followed his normal walking pace, he would have passed the bag's location around 9:34 to 9:36 p.m. This aligned with the time frames in which witnesses saw him and showed that the point where Mickey dropped the bag was not far from home, but lay squarely within the darkest and highest risk segment of the route. From there, Granger redrew the map with a combined time-location line incorporating two elements: the bag's position and the statements about two unknown individuals following the victim. If Mickey dropped the bag at the discovered spot, it was possible that an incident or quick approach occurred in the extremely short space right after turning from South 18th onto the path toward Tasker Street. The fact that the bag remained intact, neither torn nor burst, suggested that if contact occurred between Mickey and someone else, it happened in a way that caused him to let go rather than having the bag violently snatched or knocked from his grasp. Miles continued the expanded search into the area bordering Tasker Street, checking gutters, the bases of residents' stoop stairs, and patches of wild grass against walls. Although no additional evidence was found, the scene diagram now became much more specific. Mickey traveled his familiar route, moved within the expected time window, was closely followed by two unidentified individuals, and was likely approached right in the alley area, where the dark gaps provided cover for an action that went unnoticed by residents. Upon completing the expanded survey and collecting evidence item number 1, the two officers returned to the temporary staging point on Tasker Street to consolidate the data, marking the bag's location as a key point in the timeline, under the assumption that Mickey continued along his route until the moment he dropped this item. The information was entered into the file under Evidence, Stage 1, and became the basis for re-evaluating the sequence of events on the night Mickey vanished, allowing a more precise pinpointing of the first point of interruption in the victim's journey. Right after solidifying this physical evidence marker, Granger and Miles shifted to a deeper sweep of the narrow segment between the dark alley and the beginning of Tasker Street to determine whether a second piece of evidence could further tighten the timing and location of the incident. While sweeping his flashlight along the edge of the drainage gutter running against the old brick wall, Miles spotted a small object lodged in a cracked cement joint, a rectangular piece of paper torn in half, with slightly smudged ink, but still recognizable as the familiar style of receipt from Rossi's Market. Granger immediately used steel tweezers to lift the paper fragment, placed it in an evidence bag, and noted the exact position about 35 meters farther toward Tasker Street from the bag's discovery spot. What particularly caught the officer's attention was the physical condition of the receipt fragment. It was torn along an irregular line, not a straight cut, and showed a faint crease at one end, indicating it had recently been folded in a pocket or held briefly before falling. The weather that night was dry with light wind, so the fragment's precise position in the crack against the wall edge allowed the inference that it had not been blown from elsewhere but had fallen directly at that spot. Granger immediately cross-referenced Mickey's departure time from the store with the receipt fragment's appearance in the gutter. If Mickey left Rossi's Market at 9:32 p.m., he would have reached this location around 9:35 to 9:37 p.m., only a few minutes after the bag drop time. Comparing the two pieces of evidence showed that the bag and the receipt fragment did not fall near each other, but at two distinct points, separated by roughly the time it would take to walk 1 block. This ruled out the possibility that Mickey dropped all his items at the same spot. Instead, it indicated the two items were dropped at successive moments, suggesting that the chain of disruption stretched across the entire segment from the alley to the start of Tasker Street, rather than occurring in a single instant. From this, Granger formed the first hypothesis. Mickey may have been closely approached or threatened right after entering the alley, causing him to drop the paper bag, but he was still compelled or held in motion for a short additional distance before a stronger contact occurred, leading to the receipt fragment falling. Miles added the possibility that the receipt fragment fell during a moment when the victim was turned, had his arm pulled, or was shoved against the wall, movement sufficient to dislodge a thin light item from a pocket without creating loud noise. When plotted on the route map, the positions of the two pieces of evidence revealed a clear pattern. Mickey moved along his familiar path, experienced the first interruption at the turn into the alley, then continued moving in a non-voluntary state or under coercion for a short additional segment before the second interruption occurred. The distance between the 2 points was not enough for Mickey to have time to run, call for help, or change course, thereby increasing the likelihood that the approach to the victim was carried out by two coordinated individuals, one blocking or staying close from the side or front, the other pressing from behind. This fit the statements obtained from Level 1 and Level 2 witnesses during the canvass. The parallel appearance of two unknown individuals moving slowly and deliberately. Upon further analysis, the officers noted that the receipt fragment's drop location was very close to the junction where the alley met the frontage of Tasker Street, a spot where light levels changed abruptly and visibility from residents' windows dropped significantly. This was the most suitable place for the perpetrator to shift from following to direct close contact, because in those few brief seconds, The victim could be turned or forced against the wall without anyone seeing from a distance. Granger's preliminary report described the torn receipt fragment as evidence item number 2, serving to precisely identify the location of close physical contact, a crucial detail that allowed the timeline to be divided into 3 segments: the moment Mickey left the store, the moment the paper bag fell, and the moment the receipt fragment fell. The appearance of 2 pieces of evidence at separated locations reinforced the conclusion that Mickey did not vanish instantly, but went through a short sequence of interactions with one or more individuals, in which the possibility of being blocked, shoved, or restrained was entirely consistent with the collected data. Upon completing the analysis, Granger and Miles entered the receipt fragment into the evidence log and adjusted the risk analysis map, highlighting the interruption zone between the 2 pieces of evidence as the central area requiring deeper survey to determine the nature of what happened to the victim in a span of only a few minutes, but long enough to alter the entire trajectory of this missing person case. After establishing the first 2 pieces of evidence and anchoring them to Mickey's movement timeline, Officer Granger and Officer Miles shifted focus to identifying individuals who might be directly or indirectly connected to his disappearance, a mandatory step in the initial investigation phase to narrow the pool of suspects before expanding to other leads. They began by compiling a full list of known associates who had regular contact with Mickey in the 2 weeks leading up to the disappearance. Drawing from family-provided information, work shift logs at the steel mill where Mickey was employed, and identification of social relationships that could have produced conflict. This list was divided into 3 groups. Group A, immediate family members living with Mickey. Group B, friends, acquaintances, and neighbors with daily interaction. And Group C, co-workers, supervisors, and others with workplace contact. The grouping was done to assess access to the victim within the time frame close to 9:32, 9:40 p.m., and to determine who among them had motive, means, or opportunity to interfere with Mickey's journey. Group A was quickly eliminated from suspicion because no one left the house during the incident window, and all participated in the search as soon as Mickey failed to return on time, an element consistent with statements and aligned with the overall event timeline. Group A received closer scrutiny because it included people who could observe Mickey's travel habits and daily routine, especially those aware he usually walked alone in the evenings. From this group, Granger flagged 2 notable individuals: Elijah Booker, a longtime acquaintance who often met Mickey after work, and a man named Dean Murphy, who lived near the rear of the row house block and had a habit of standing on his stoop at night. However, Murphy had no recorded conflict with the victim, while Elijah's closeness required Granger to consider the possibility of insider knowledge about Mickey's habits, leading to Elijah's classification as person requiring interview to determine scope of involvement. Group C, the steel mill workers, was expanded because the harsh work environment sometimes led to arguments or grudges. While checking the shift roster, Miles found the name Charles Hawthorne, a co-worker on the same shift as Mickey, the night he vanished, and with a recorded minor dispute the previous week. Hawthorne had raised his voice to Mickey about task division in the mill, and though the argument was not severe, it was logged in the supervisor's shift book as an item to monitor. This provided grounds to place Hawthorne on the list of individuals requiring immediate interview once baseline data was sufficient. After completing the list of significant contacts, Granger and Miles categorized levels of relevance based on 3 criteria: proximity of contact to the time of disappearance, potential for conflict, and possibility of presence in the area where Mickey vanished. Elijah Booker, despite his closeness to Mickey, showed no recent signs of conflict, but because he knew the victim's daily schedule well, he was ranked as indirectly relevant, alibi verification required, medium priority in the investigative process. Charles Hawthorne fell into the group where motive could plausibly arise, even if not strong, but because he worked alongside Mickey on the very night of the incident, he was classified as directly relevant, immediate interview required, higher priority. The remaining individuals in the friends and co-workers groups were noted, but not placed on the priority list due to lack of conflict data or evidence placing them near the incident area. Overall, Granger observed that the two most prominent names across the entire list were Elijah Booker and Charles Hawthorne. One a close acquaintance with potential detailed knowledge of Mickey's habits, and one a coworker with a documented prior dispute. This was a logical starting point to narrow the investigation, as both had recent contact with the victim and could provide critical information about his state of mind, schedule, or any unusual interactions before he vanished. Miles compiled a relevant summary table and submitted it to activate formal interviews. Elijah Booker was placed in the category alibi verification and background information required, while Charles Hawthorne was flagged as potential risk factor, interview required to determine motive or unusual behavior. This classification was not an accusation of guilt against anyone, but a means to establish a rational investigative direction based on scene data and the victim's relationship network, especially given that the two dropped items along the route indicated direct human intervention in Mickey's journey. By the end of the narrowing phase, the relationship diagram was complete with clearly classified connection lines between Mickey and his known associates. Only two names, Booker and Hawthorne, stood out with sufficient levels of contact and risk to warrant inclusion in the next phase of interviews. This result became the basis for the investigative team to move into direct contact to determine whether either individual was connected to the interruption in Mickey's journey. Immediately after the diagram was finalized, Elijah Booker was placed at the top of the priority interview list, and contact was initiated the following morning at the small apartment he rented about 4 blocks from Tasker Street. Elijah, 20 years old, worked part-time at a garage near Passyunk Avenue, and was recorded as a close acquaintance of Mickey, with no significant history of conflict. When the two officers arrived, Elijah was cooperative, agreeing to provide information without requesting an attorney, a natural response from someone who did not believe he was connected to any criminal act. Granger began by asking about Elijah's activities on the evening of July 14, requesting as detailed a timeline as possible. Elijah stated that he was at his girlfriend Clara Jennings's apartment from around 7 p.m. until nearly midnight, and did not leave during the entire period when Mickey disappeared. He described Clara living on the second floor of a small building, and that evening, the two of them stayed in the room watching television, never going out or meeting anyone else. The specific times Elijah provided were that he arrived at Clara's around 7 p.m., stayed until about 11:20 p.m., and then went home. Granger noted each time point in detail, especially the 9:30, 9:40 p.m. window when Mickey vanished, and asked whether anyone else could corroborate his presence there besides Clara. Elijah replied that only Clara was with him and no other visitors came by. Miles continued to verify whether Elijah had left the apartment briefly to buy something, make a call, or run any similar errand. Elijah insisted he had not left at all during the evening. Elijah's demeanor and account were fairly consistent, but because his alibi rested solely on his own statement and one corroborating witness, Granger marked it as external alibi, dependent on one corroboration, meaning the alibi depended entirely on verification with the involved party. However, under 1964 investigative procedures, the priority given to alibi verification in the early stages was not high, especially when the case still showed no clear signs of violence and the victim remained classified as a missing person rather than a crime victim. Therefore, rather than immediately contacting Clara to confirm the times, Granger only noted the need for further verification under follow-up pending, but did not request immediate action. This became the first gap in the interview process with Elijah, leaving his alibi as unverified information in the file. When asked about Mickey's travel habits, Elijah confirmed that the victim always used the familiar route and rarely changed it. He also verified that Mickey usually walked alone in the evenings, carried no valuables, and had no habit of interacting with strangers on the street. When Granger asked about the two unknown individuals witnesses saw following Mickey, Elijah said he did not know anyone matching that description and could not speculate on their identities. This was a point the officers noted. Elijah could offer no useful information about the followers, which did not make him a suspect, but placed him in the position of unable to provide investigative leads, making his alibi even more necessary to verify independently to rule out involvement. Miles continued questioning the recent relationship between Elijah and Mickey. Elijah responded that things were normal, no arguments, and they had not planned to meet that night, even though they occasionally had coffee after shifts in the past. When asked whether Mickey had mentioned meeting anyone, expressing any concerns, or changing any habits, Elijah stated, "No," leading Granger to note there were no prior signs indicating Mickey had voluntarily altered his route or faced personal risk. However, what caught the officer's attention was the coincidence. Elijah and Mickey often met in the evenings, yet on the specific night Mickey vanished, they did not. This was not incriminating evidence, but it was enough for Granger to record Elijah's relevance level as medium relevance. Further check required, meaning additional clarification was needed before clearing him. The error in the interview process arose because Granger and Miles, due to night shift pressure, and because the file was still treated as a missing person case rather than a crime, did not take the critical step of immediately verifying Elijah's statement by contacting Clara Jennings that same night or early the next morning. The delay in alibi confirmation meant their entire assessment of Elijah rested solely on self-reported information, a standard insufficient for solid investigation. Although Elijah could provide no information about the two unknown individuals or the Mercury vehicle appearing at the scene, the uncertainty surrounding the unverified alibi kept him in the main suspect pool with the evaluation. Close personal connection, opportunity for contact prior to disappearance. Alibi unverified, relevance level, medium, but requires monitoring. Recording Elijah in the suspect list did not stem from evidence against him, but from the investigative principle of that era. Anyone with close ties to the victim near the time of the event had to remain under scrutiny until their alibi was fully confirmed. At the conclusion of the interview, Granger completed the report, signed under alibi pending verification, and officially marked Elijah Booker as one of the two priority subjects in the next phase of the missing person file. Despite the absence of physical evidence implicating him or any indication that he was present in the area where Mickey disappeared during the critical time window. After completing the interview with Elijah Booker and recording his unverified alibi in the file, Officer Granger and Officer Miles shifted to a parallel investigative lead based on a key piece of data appearing in multiple witness statements. The presence of a gray Mercury Monterey moving unusually slowly around the area where Mickey left Rossi's Market and along his route toward Tasker Street. Since a vehicle was one of the most traceable elements in the 1964 investigative context, they decided to compile a list of all gray Mercury Montereys registered within a feasible radius for a perpetrator to have traveled during the critical window of 9:30 to 9:45 p.m. To do this, the two officers needed access to the Pennsylvania Department of Motor Vehicles registration records, which were stored as printed ledgers, organized by county, and updated quarterly. The following morning, Miles went to the records office per shift assignment to request copies of the list of Mercury Monterey vehicles manufactured between 1963, in gray or silver gray, registered in three areas: South Philadelphia, Lower Moyamensing, and Girard Estate, locations where owners could plausibly have passed through Tasker Street on the night of the incident. After nearly an hour of manual review, Miles obtained a list of 47 gray Mercury Montereys registered and active in the affected area. The list included owner names, residential addresses, vehicle model year, and current registration status. Cross-referencing this with the area map Granger had prepared the previous night, Miles narrowed it to owners living within a maximum 6-block radius of where Mickey disappeared, as this was a reasonable distance for someone who regularly traveled past Tasker Street. In the list, only 6 owners resided close enough to warrant consideration, and among those 6, one name immediately stood out to Granger: Samuel O'Neill, owner of a 1961 gray Mercury Monterey, registered at an address less than 2 blocks from the alley where the paper bag was found. O'Neill's residence being so close to the disappearance area, combined with his vehicle matching the description from 2 witnesses, placed him in a technical position requiring interview as soon as possible to determine whether his car had been present at the scene. Granger marked O'Neill with the code P1, priority interview, meaning a priority subject due to the matching vehicle description, a rare element in a case with almost no physical evidence in the early stages. However, instead of immediately proceeding with the standard procedure, approaching the owner, inspecting the vehicle's condition, and questioning its use on the night in question, Granger and Miles deferred O'Neill's interview to the end of the day's tasks, citing that the file was still classified as a missing person case, not a criminal matter, and that they prioritized completing additional resident statements first. In the context of limited manpower and the procedural constraints of 1964 investigations, this decision was not unusual, but it inadvertently created a significant gap. Information about a vehicle fitting the suspect description was not acted upon promptly, leaving the connection between O'Neill and Mickey's disappearance at the level of notable, but unexploited. When Miles consolidated the full list of 47 vehicles and plotted residence locations on the map, the pattern showed that only O'Neill lived in an area that plausibly explained the Mercury Monterey's appearance during the exact time frame noted by witnesses. The remaining owners were scattered in more distant areas where passing through Tasker Street at that hour would have been unlikely given local traffic and habits. Although this data placed O'Neill in the potential suspect pool, Granger recorded his relevance in the file only as vehicle relevance, unverified, meaning a vehicle match existed, but no proof yet placed the person or car at the scene. The failure to interview promptly meant the file gained no additional substantive information to strengthen O'Neill's role in the time frame of Mickey's disappearance. Ultimately, upon completing the vehicle list review and mapping residences, Granger and Miles concluded that the gray Mercury Monterey's appearance remained the most noteworthy piece of vehicle-related information. However, because they could not yet verify who was driving the Mercury on the night of July 14th and had not obtained direct statements from any listed owners, especially Samuel O'Neill, the officers noted this investigative lead under pending contact, keeping it as a critical but incomplete branch. Determining O'Neill's level of relevance was temporarily deferred, placing him in the group of subjects to monitor and ensuring the vehicle-related investigative path remained open. Immediately after finishing the Mercury vehicle review and noting O'Neill as the most prominent vehicle owner, Granger and Miles moved to interview the remaining individual in the close relationship diagram with the victim, Charles Hawthorne, who along with Booker was one of the two names with significant contact with Mickey in the days leading up to his disappearance. The Booker interview had shown an unverified alibi, but with no corroborating data and no clear conflict, Granger decided to shift focus to the remaining subject, the only one with a documented public dispute with Mickey in the week before the disappearance. The Hawthorne interview took place that same afternoon at the steel mill, where he and Mickey worked, in a small break room behind the metal press area. Hawthorne, 24 years old, appeared calm but guarded when the two officers arrived. He agreed to cooperate with police, but showed caution regarding questions about his conflict with Mickey. Granger began by asking Hawthorne to describe exactly what had happened in the argument the previous week. Hawthorne stated that the dispute was only about work division. Mickey had exceeded his shift quota that day, making Hawthorne feel pressured to speed up on the remaining tasks. The argument had been tense but brief, and both returned to work within the same shift. According to Hawthorne, it was just a minor clash between coworkers and nothing that would turn into anything more serious. Granger cross-checked this against the supervisor's shift log entry, which recorded the argument as not serious but needs monitoring, confirming the conflict had occurred, but showed no signs of escalation. Granger then moved to questions about Hawthorne's whereabouts on the night Mickey vanished. He left the mill at exactly 9 p.m. and went straight home in southern Girard Estate. Hawthorne said he walked home alone, made no stops, and met no one after work. When asked whether he saw Mickey leave the mill or knew what Mickey planned to do afterward, Hawthorne replied that he only saw Mickey pack up and head left, but did not know where he went or if he met anyone. The timeline Hawthorne provided immediately caught Granger's attention. Hawthorne left at 9 p.m., Mickey 5 minutes later toward Rossi's Market, The two paths did not intersect on normal routes and did not overlap in time. This raised the possibility that Hawthorne was not in the area where Mickey disappeared between 9:30 and 9:40 p.m., the critical window of the incident. Miles continued by asking whether Hawthorne owned a car. He answered that he did not and usually walked from the mill to home, a route far from Tasker Street. When the officers asked if he knew anyone around Tasker Street or had any reason to be there on the night Mickey vanished, Hawthorne shook his head in denial. He insisted he knew no one in the area and had never had occasion to pass through at night. All this data led Granger to mark Hawthorne's timeline as potential alibi needs contextual verification, a form of alibi without corroboration but not contradicted by objective data, since the distance from the mill to Girard Estate and Mickey's route were in completely different directions. When asked further about his relationship with Mickey beyond the minor dispute, Hawthorne said he had no personal issues. Mickey was quiet and usually focused on work. He denied any other arguments after the previous week's incident and asserted he had no reason to follow the victim or interfere with his journey. From Granger and Miles's perspective, although they noted Hawthorne's prior argument with Mickey, the level of conflict did not create a clear motive, and no scene data placed Hawthorne near the disappearance point. Moreover, witness descriptions of the two unknown individuals following Mickey did not match Hawthorne's build, a detail that, while not sufficient to clear him, reduced his relevance level. After concluding the interview, which lasted over 40 minutes, no element suggested Hawthorne was lying or concealing anything. His described timeline fit the logical movement of that evening, and no physical evidence or witness placed him near Tasker Street during the incident window. Therefore, Granger marked Hawthorne's file as low relevance, insufficient data for continued suspicion, meaning low relevance, and insufficient information to keep him as a primary focus. Although his name remained in the monitoring group for any new data, Hawthorne was officially removed from the main suspect pool at the end of the interview, and the investigation once again returned to scene-related data involving the two unknown individuals and the Mercury Monterey present during Mickey's disappearance window. Immediately after concluding the Charles Hawthorne interview and determining his relevance was not strong enough to remain in the primary suspect group, Officer Granger and Officer Miles returned to the investigative direction stemming from evidence along Mickey's travel route, a direction that required thorough examination of physical locations, potentially directly linked to the point where the victim was interrupted. In particular, based on the positions of the paper bag and receipt fragment, separated by just over 1 block, the two officers recognized the need to check abandoned houses along this path, because old row house structures featured numerous side entrances, rear doors, and shadowed areas that could easily conceal the movements of one or more individuals for a few brief minutes. According to the city's archived maps, the 3-block radius around Mickey's disappearance area contained a total of 14 houses listed as vacant or awaiting repair, distributed along South 18th Street, the alley, and the Tasker Street row. The survey began with the first block, where 2 long vacant houses had been sealed due to structural decay. Granger checked front doors, rear doors, and the first floor with a flashlight, but found no signs of forced entry or disturbed items. The remaining houses in this zone showed nothing unusual beyond dust and old furniture abandoned years earlier. Moving to the second block, Miles inspected 4 houses adjacent to the alley, where the likelihood of someone hiding was higher due to dim lighting and low foot traffic. There they found a few recent signs of activity: cigarette butts, glass bottles, old footprints. But after comparing with resident-provided information, Miles noted these were most likely traces of teenagers hanging out rather than related to the disappearance. However, upon approaching 1427 Tasker Street, located right near evidence item number 2's position, and previously identified as the highest risk point in the initial analysis, Granger immediately noticed far more anomalies than in the other houses. The wooden front door had a crack running along the lower hinge, fresh paint peeling around the door frame, and faint shoe impressions on the ground in front of the stoop, though not clear enough to determine size. Shining the flashlight through a door gap, Granger observed short, uneven parallel disturbances in the dust on the wooden floor, resembling drag marks or recent footsteps, inconsistent with a house abandoned for over 2 years. Inside the living room were two unusually pale wall patches, a common sign of a wall having been patched or replastered, but not uniformly repainted. Notably, one of these patches was on the west side of the room, directly corresponding to the time-space position where Mickey could have passed according to the timeline Miles had marked the previous night. This led Granger to flag 1427 Tasker as the most anomalous of all 14 surveyed houses. However, investigative protocol at that time, while the file remained classified as a missing person case with no confirmed evidence of crime, meant the officers lacked authority to break locks, breach walls, or perform any structural intrusion without command approval or a search warrant. They could only inspect through doors and windows, document external anomalies, and file a report recommending further review. Miles attempted to look through a slightly open first-floor left window gap, but saw only darkness and dust-covered flooring. What troubled him most was the two distinctly smoother wall sections compared to the rest, suggesting something had been removed or a wall cavity had been recently repaired. This was an uncommon anomaly in other abandoned houses where deterioration was uniform without localized repair signs. Despite these suspicious indicators, Granger chose to follow procedures strictly, recording only wall shows signs of prior intervention in the report rather than proceeding to open walls or request immediate deeper resources. His failure to promptly recommend a search warrant, partly because the case had not yet exceeded missing person scope, partly due to limited investigative manpower late at night, became a major oversight. The house containing the most compelling signs was not accessed to the necessary degree. Ultimately, in the consolidated report submitted to superiors, 1427 Tasker was marked as the highest risk point, but no follow-up action was taken that night, missing the opportunity for timely verification of the traces right on the first day of the investigation. After completing the survey of the 14 abandoned houses, including 1427 Tasker, with its numerous anomalies, but no permission for deeper inspection, Officer Granger and Officer Miles returned to the precinct to consolidate all data collected during the first 2 days of the investigation. As morning light filtered through the report room windows, they spread out the area map, reorganized witness statements, evidence locations, and marked the surveyed risk points. However, when all the data was placed side by side, the case's biggest problem became clear. No witness had directly seen Mickey being approached, threatened, or taken away, and no one could confirm a specific event at the moment he vanished. Statements from the 3 blocks described only indirect events, 2 strangers following, a Mercury Monterey moving slowly, but none led to identifiable descriptions or clear actions. This left the investigative team unable to tie any specific individual to the victim's disappearance process. At the same time, the absence of a body, clothing, blood, drag marks, signs of struggle, or any violence indicators in the surveyed area left the investigation without a physical foundation to determine the nature of the incident, whether Mickey was attacked, forced away, or disappeared in some other traceless manner. The 2 pieces of evidence, the paper bag and receipt fragment, only pinpointed interruption points along the journey, but because they were neither torn nor unusually deformed, they provided insufficient data to assess the form of third-party intervention. The disturbed wall at 1427 Tasker created the strongest suspicion, but without a search warrant and without clear proof of criminal indicators, Granger could only enter the detail as anomaly, but cause undetermined, preventing it from becoming a basis for expanded investigation. Simultaneously, no evidence directly pointed to any specific suspect. Elijah Booker had an unverified alibi with no data placing him in the area at the time of Mickey's disappearance. Charles Hawthorne had a minor dispute with Mickey, but his route and timeline did not align with the scene. Samuel O'Neill, the owner of the matching Mercury, had still not been interviewed, leaving insufficient data to elevate him to primary suspect status. Witnesses offered only general descriptions of 2 unknown individuals, insufficient to confirm identities or clear features for pursuit. There were no hospital alerts, no accident reports, no signs Mickey had left the city, and no information suggesting he had run away voluntarily. When Granger compiled the file for submission to command, he clearly noted three major bottlenecks: lack of direct eyewitnesses, lack of physical evidence confirming criminal activity, and lack of suspects with reliable data for deeper interview. In the context of limited investigative resources, no strong criminal indicators, and a search yielding no concrete results, the team had to face the reality that they lacked legal or procedural grounds to maintain the file at high priority. Granger's consolidated report explicitly stated that, despite surveying the entire route, interviewing the victim's close associates, reviewing suspect vehicles, and checking 14 abandoned houses, no findings met the threshold to reclassify the case from missing person to suspected criminal matter. He concluded that the case had reached information saturation, where all approaches lacked sufficient data to proceed. Therefore, in a brief meeting with superiors, Granger recommended suspending active investigation pending new leads, while keeping the file open for reactivation if additional information emerged. This was a standard procedural decision in the 1964 context, but it also marked the moment Mickey Harrington's disappearance ceased to be actively pursued, slipping into prolonged limbo, a state that froze the case's progress at its most critical early stage. After the consolidated report from Officer Granger was submitted, and the three major bottlenecks of the case were clearly identified: no direct witnesses, no body, no specific evidence leading to a suspect, the Philadelphia Police Department Command decided to reclassify Mickey Harrington's missing person file as unsolved, inactive, a category typically applied to cases where all investigative avenues had been exhausted but yielded no results strong enough to continue. This decision was issued at the end of July 1964, less than 3 weeks after the night Mickey vanished, marking the official shift of the case from active investigation to passive file storage status. In the records office, a notation sheet reading "Unsolved, Inactive Status" was attached to the front page of the file, and related documents were reorganized in sequence. Scene reports, route diagrams, witness statements, interview records of Elijah Booker and Charles Hawthorne, registered Mercury vehicle list, abandoned house survey report, and the bottleneck summary. The two primary pieces of evidence, the paper bag and the torn receipt fragment, were placed in separate evidence bags labeled Evidence, Category B, meaning items of potential relevance, but insufficient to warrant expanded investigation. They were stored in a standard wooden evidence box, along with description forms and discovery locations, then sealed, before being transferred to the storage vault. Notably, under procedures of the time, evidence from missing person cases was not preserved to the strict standards applied to criminal cases. Therefore, storage quality depended on vault conditions and unit priority levels, a factor that later became one of the reasons many old files could not be immediately exploited when needed. At the investigative level, the suspension decision meant no officers were assigned to continue monitoring the case, and no further interviews, inquiries, or reviews were conducted. Data on the two unknown individuals following Mickey, the gray Mercury Monterey present at the critical time, and the 1427 Tasker House, with signs of wall disturbance, were merely recorded in the file without further development. No requests for additional resources were made, no search warrants were proposed, and the name Samuel O'Neill, the only individual whose vehicle matched the description, was never interviewed during this phase. From the moment the file changed status, the investigative process completely halted. The South Philadelphia community received no further notifications or updates about the disappearance, causing Mickey's case to gradually fade from the already overloaded internal reports of the 1960s. On paper, the case remained open per regulations, but in practice, it was no longer actively reviewed. Residents who had provided statements were not recontacted, and Mickey's family received only a brief notice that police would continue to monitor if new information emerged. In reality, this notice effectively shifted all responsibility to the family, while the investigative agency retained only a passive information receipt function without taking any further proactive steps. As August 1964 passed, Mickey Harrington's file was placed in storage alongside many other missing person cases of the decade, sinking into an impasse with no way out. From a professional standpoint, closing the file was an inevitable consequence of the era's lack of surveillance technology, modern forensic data, and specialized missing persons investigative manpower. Nevertheless, it was also the turning point that caused the case to receive no attention for many years afterward, leaving a prolonged information gap and allowing the disappearance to slip gradually out of active investigative orbit. When the evidence vault door closed, Mickey Harrington's file officially entered unsolved, inactive status, with no one aware that this decision would bury the truth for decades to come. 42 years after Mickey Harrington's file was reclassified as unsolved, inactive, the disappearance had virtually vanished from the Philadelphia Police Department's active archival stream, surviving only as an old set of documents buried deep in the southern storage vault of headquarters. During the periodic inventory review in 2006, a procedure to assess the condition of long-dormant files spanning multiple decades, the archives team examined inactive cases from before 1970, including Mickey's file for integrity verification. The file was pulled from a high shelf, its cover thick with dust, the interior pages darkened to a deep yellow by time, and many sheets brittle and prone to tearing when turned. The scene report, route diagram, and interview records remained intact, but the handwriting had faded slightly, with some areas of ink bleeding, making rereading difficult. The two stored pieces of evidence in the wooden box, the paper bag and receipt fragment, were inspected per inventory protocol, and their condition clearly showed the effects of time. The paper bag had gradually rotted, its folds stiffened and frayed, and one corner tore completely when the archivist lifted it for inspection. The receipt fragment was almost entirely faded. The originally faint printed text from 1964 now consisted only of illegible smudges. Storage conditions in the old evidence room, high humidity, seasonal temperature fluctuations, and no material anti-aging system had rendered both items nearly unusable for any future analysis. Some supplementary documents, such as the registered mercury list, had peeling corners, and notations about area owners showed smudging that made original data harder to confirm. The survey report on the 14 abandoned houses remained, but the description pertaining to 1427 Tasker was lightly faded at the page edges, and the attached diagram had blurred significantly, making small details very difficult to discern. Overall, the entire file exhibited clear deterioration over time, with no documents ever duplicated or transferred to better preservation formats during the 4 decades. The inventory also revealed another reality from 1964 to 2006. There had been no official reinvestigation effort whatsoever regarding Mickey's disappearance. No request to reopen the file, no supplementary reports, no personnel assigned to review old materials. Mickey's name appeared only sporadically in compilations of long-term missing persons, but was never moved to a group requiring re-evaluation. This reflected the context of previous decades, when missing person cases lacking clear evidence of violence were typically deemed lacking legal basis for priority and sidelined from active investigation lists. With no modern trace analysis technology, no updated evidence management systems, and no dedicated cold case unit, Mickey's file became one of hundreds forgotten over time. Upon completing the inventory, the team noted that the file remained structurally intact, but significantly degraded in quality due to time factors, and placed it on a list of dormant files needing reclassification under new procedures. However, like many other old missing person cases, Mickey's file was returned to the shelf, as no new elements had yet emerged to change its status at that point. The inventory only confirmed one thing: 42 years had passed with zero progress, and the evidence that once constituted key leads had become weakened objects, no longer capable of supporting investigation without new supplementary data. In 2006, at the same time, the archives conducted their periodic review of dormant files. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office launched a new program to review missing person cases and unsolved homicides from the 1960s, 1980s, amid the city's efforts to establish a dedicated cold case unit to handle cases with remaining solvability potential based on advances in forensics and modern investigative methods. The program required selecting a group of old files each year for re-evaluation, prioritizing those with inconsistencies in the original investigation or cases likely to yield new leads through modern techniques. When a list of over 200 files was forwarded to the cold case unit, the new investigative team began screening according to three criteria: completeness of archived documentation, recoverability of evidence, and potential for new leads from witnesses, locations, or analytical technology. Mickey Harrington's file, though classified as unsolved, inactive, since 1964, appeared at the end of the list, but entered the re-evaluation group for a special reason. It was one of the few missing person cases with preserved scene evidence, albeit degraded in quality, and a relatively clear route diagram, enabling the cold case unit to reassess risk points under current standards. During the preliminary file review, senior investigator Linda Carver noticed numerous anomalies in the original investigative process: two pieces of evidence dropped at separate locations but never deeply linked, two witnesses noting a suspect vehicle but the owner never interviewed, and especially the notation about 1427 Tasker showing signs of wall disturbance, a detail that should have prompted a search warrant but was completely overlooked. These irregularities made Mickey's case unlike typical 1960s missing person incidents, where victims often left the city, became entangled in family conflicts, or met undetermined accidents. In contrast, this case showed a clear interruption in travel, the presence of two unknown individuals, and a vehicle matching the timing. Carver flagged the file in the group: possibility of foul play, needs evaluation, meaning a case with potential criminal involvement not yet determined, an element sufficient to qualify for review. An internal meeting was held to select the 2006 cold case files, and Mickey's was included in the list of 12 with recovery potential. The reason lay not in the evidence, which had severely deteriorated, but in the case structure: short route, clear interruption points, witness descriptions of two followers, and a vehicle fitting the time-location data. Additionally, the disappearance occurred in a densely populated residential area, yet produced no loud noises or incident reports, raising the hypothesis of a quick, discreet, and deliberate act, a characteristic often associated with organized or multi-perpetrator crimes. All these factors led the cold case team to conclude that approaching the case with modern techniques, especially reanalysis of the scene and expanded interviews, had genuine potential to uncover new leads. Ultimately, after 3 screening rounds, Mickey Harrington's file was officially selected for re-examination. Carver signed the decision to temporarily place the file in review stage, meaning not yet a formal reopening of investigation, but the start of systematic detail-by-detail checking, re-evaluating the route, cross-referencing witness statements, comparing evidence against modern analytical methods, and assessing the reasonableness of each step in the 1964 investigation. This phase was not a formal reopening, but a preliminary step for the cold case unit to determine whether the case had sufficient elements to present to the DA for reactivation. When the file reached Carver's desk, no one in the investigation room at that moment knew that the decision to place a 19-year-old's disappearance back on the review list would become a pivotal turning point, opening the door to a truth buried for 4 decades. While the cold case unit was conducting the file review phase and preparing to evaluate each detail under modern investigative standards, an unexpected event occurred that became the explosive turning point altering the entire case trajectory. The city approved a demolition plan for 3 severely dilapidated houses on Tasker Street, including 1427 Tasker, the very location where Granger and Miles had noted signs of wall disturbance in 1964, but could not inspect deeply due to lack of a search warrant. In early September 2006, the city's demolition crew approached the site, following standard procedures for old house removal, beginning by dismantling sections of wall to prevent sudden collapse. When they broke through the west side plaster in the living room, the position previously flagged as anomalous in the 1964 report, the workers noticed the underlying brick was inconsistent. The bricks in that section were darker in color, the mortar fresher, and the arrangement did not follow the original 1920s row house structure pattern. Recognizing this was not natural deterioration, the site supervisor ordered a test drill along the joint line, and within seconds, the drill bit penetrated an unusual void. As the hole was widened, mortar dust and brick fragments fell away, and at the same time, a dry, acrid, unfamiliar odor escaped from within, a sign that prompted the crew to halt work per protocol when encountering an abnormal wall cavity potentially related to legal factors. They immediately called police according to city procedure for discoveries of unnatural structural interference. Patrol officers arrived, conducted a preliminary check, and quickly realized this was no ordinary construction issue. The rebuilt brick section was too uniformly laid compared to the overall decay of the house, and the mortar clearly dated to two entirely different periods. As they continued removing the brick, they discovered a void approximately 6 feet high and over 20 inches wide, large enough to contain a sizable object. Shining flashlights inside the wall cavity revealed the outline of a human skeleton leaning against the rear brick, fully decomposed with only the skeletal structure and a few scraps of decayed material remaining. Police immediately secured the scene and summoned the CSI team for forensic collection. Upon approaching the wall recess, technicians noted the skeleton in a fixed position, both arm bones crossed over the chest, as if once restrained, ribs showing slight deformation, and the skull bearing a long crack running from the left temple across the forehead, a sign typically indicating blunt force impact or direct trauma. Though only bones remained, some non-decomposed physical traces persisted: a frayed cloth cord wrapped around the wrist bones, and several small metal fragments at the bottom of the cavity. Next to the skeleton was a distinctive item, a single house key attached to a metal keychain bearing the Harrington Steel Works logo, the mill where Mickey had worked before disappearing. This detail was immediately flagged because the old file confirmed that Mickey always carried his house key and work key on the same small keychain, and when he vanished, neither was found in his room or on his person. This highly specific evidence became the first major identifier linking the 1427 Tasker wall cavity to the 1964 disappearance. As technicians collected bone samples, they discovered one more characteristic item: a dark fabric scrap pressed between two layers of brick and rib bones, bearing a faint pattern resembling the workshirt pockets issued by the steel mill to employees in the 1960s. All evidence was packaged to modern standards and transferred to the forensics lab. News of the skeleton discovery in the wall cavity was immediately relayed to the cold case unit. When investigator Linda Carver received notification that human remains had been found in the exact house flagged for wall disturbance in the 1964 report, she promptly requested full scene sealing and reclassified Mickey Harrington's file from review stage to active reevaluation because this discovery not only carried clear criminal indicators, but also aligned with the investigative oversights previously documented in the original file. With the emergence of skeletal remains and victim-specific evidence, the 1964 disappearance was officially reclassified from an unsolved missing person case to one with evident criminal involvement, ushering in an entirely new phase for an investigation that had been missed for over 4 decades. The skeletal remains found in the wall cavity of 1427 Tasker Street were immediately transferred to the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office for comprehensive examination, and this process became the first critical step in determining whether the skeleton belonged to Mickey Harrington, as well as clarifying the cause of death and the circumstances leading to it. Technicians began by taking full X-rays of the skeleton to assess bone condition, identify trauma marks, reconstruct fractured sections, and check for any foreign objects lodged in the bone structure. Initial results showed a long crack in the skull in the left temporal region, extending down near the eye socket, a typical injury pattern from heavy blunt force impact with a hard object. The crack showed no signs of healing or callus formation, indicating the trauma occurred immediately before or at the moment of death. Several left side ribs also exhibited mild deformation, suggesting compression or strong impact to the chest area. The extent of this damage was consistent with rapidly fatal trauma due to internal bleeding or severe brain injury. The forensic pathologist's preliminary conclusion stated, cause of death most likely blunt force head trauma, resulting in skull fracture and immediate or near immediate death. In addition to impact-related injuries, the examination team clearly identified signs that the victim had been restrained prior to death. The wrist bones showed shallow but uniform compression grooves encircling the circumference, consistent with being bound by a soft cord for a short period sufficient to leave impressions even after full decomposition. When compared to the decayed cloth cord fragment found with the remains in the wall cavity, Specialists determined the material was a common industrial woven cord from the 1960s, typically used for bundling goods or light rope, not everyday household items. This material would not leave deep marks like coarse rope, but was sufficient to produce the compression grooves observed on the bones. This finding reinforced the hypothesis that the victim had been subdued before receiving the fatal blow. To establish the time of death, the forensic team analyzed the degree of bone degradation, condition of remaining soft tissue, mineral loss, and degree of surface calcification. The stable decomposition values indicated death occurred approximately 40 to 42 years prior to exhumation, perfectly aligning with the year Mickey disappeared, 1964. Notably, the wall cavity environment where the remains were found provided stable temperature and humidity conditions, slowing decomposition compared to outdoor exposure and allowing for more precise post-mortem interval estimation. Isotopic analysis of long bones showed no evidence the victim survived beyond the disappearance date, meaning death occurred very close to the time Mickey left Rossi's Market and vanished from the community. Additionally, the forensic team compared dental records with historical dental files provided by the family, a rare surviving document from the 1960s. A slight misalignment of the front teeth and an old silver filling in the upper right molar matched Mickey's dental records exactly, confirming the skeleton's identity without requiring further DNA testing. Beyond identification, the forensic team noted two additional important details. First, the right-hand bones showed a perimortem fracture, very close to the time of death, possibly from the victim raising his hand to defend against an attack. Second, the leg bones showed no fractures or impediments, indicating the victim did not attempt to flee, but was quickly overpowered. No metallic foreign bodies were present in the body, ruling out stabbing with a sharp weapon. All data pointed to a mechanism of death by blunt force combined with restraint, concealment of the body in a wall cavity, and immediate bricking over afterward. The official forensic report concluded three key points. 1. The victim died from severe head trauma. 2. Time of death occurred within hours after Mickey was last seen in 1964. 3. Clear evidence of restraint and body concealment, confirming this as an intentional homicide rather than an accident or voluntary disappearance. When the forensic results reached the cold case unit, they became the single most important piece of evidence since the incident, establishing the criminal nature of the event from 42 years earlier and mandating a full reopening of the investigation. With forensic confirmation that the remains found in the wall of 1427 Tasker belonged to Mickey Harrington, the cold case unit immediately began reconstructing the entire timeline of the night of July 14, 1964, to precisely determine the time and location of the attack, while modeling the perpetrator's possible movements in the initial minutes after contact. Senior investigator Linda Carver started by aligning the body's location, hidden in a first-floor living room wall cavity at 1427 Tasker, with Mickey's route from Rossi's Market toward home. From the point he left the store at 9:32 p.m. to evidence item number 1's location, around 9:35 p.m., and evidence item number 2 around 9:37 p.m. The distance between the two drop points and the abandoned house formed a linear sequence matching the victim's initial direction of travel. Cross-referencing 1964 maps with current scene diagrams, Carver determined the attack most likely occurred in the narrow stretch between South 18th Street and the entrance to Tasker Street, where lighting was poorest and witness visibility was most limited. The dropped evidence showed no signs of violent struggle, indicating initial contact produced no loud noise, and the two items falling at points separated by just over half a block suggested the victim was controlled in a manner that forced him to move a short additional distance before full subjugation. Combining time data, Carver narrowed the attack window to 9:35–9:40 p.m., as this was the only period consistent with both witness statements and the evidence drop pattern. This 5-minute span became the central reference frame for the entire timeline. From there, the team worked to establish feasible perpetrator movement patterns in the minutes immediately surrounding the attack. An initial hypothesis emerged: if the perpetrator consisted of two individuals, one staying close behind Mickey, the other maintaining distance to avoid notice, they could close in with just a few accelerated steps as the victim entered the dark stretch. Forensic data on wrist binding marks and injury severity indicated the victim was subdued very rapidly, with no signs of prolonged flight or resistance. Carver and her team used scaled diagrams of the Tasker alley and distances from the turn to the door of 1427 Tasker to simulate the time required to overpower the victim and move him inside. With an approximate distance of 45-50 meters from evidence item number 2's drop point to the house entrance, if the perpetrator used shoulder pressure or arm lock from behind, they would need less than 20-25 seconds to drag the victim inside, especially if a rear door or window was already open or easily accessible. The immediate re-bricking of the wall afterward indicated the perpetrator had access to or ability to use the house without drawing external attention. From this data, Carver constructed the perpetrator's initial movement model as follows. 1. Tailing the victim from Rossi's Market, maintaining distance to avoid suspicion. 2. Accelerating upon the victim's turn into the dark alley segment. 3. Subduing the victim by wrist restraint or wall push, consistent with the right hand fracture and rib deformation. 4. Forcing the victim toward 1427 Tasker. 5. Moving him inside and delivering the fatal blow in a very short time. The total span from Mickey leaving the store to body concealment was estimated at only 12-15 minutes. Notably, Carver observed that if the perpetrator had a vehicle, it could have been parked in a nearby block to avoid notice before the act, allowing foot approach and vehicle departure afterward. The team simulated 4 possible escape routes: back out to South 18th Street through rear row house paths toward Passayunk Avenue, or looping around Tasker Street to a main road. Each was analyzed based on 1964 streetlight placement and witness sightlines. The most feasible escape route appeared to be turning into rear row house alleys to avoid main streetlights, then circling to Passayunk, a low-risk direction for avoiding observation. From this entire model, Carver reconstructed a minute-by-minute timeline. 9:32 p.m. Mickey leaves Rossi's Market. 9:35 p.m. Evidence item number 1 drops. 9:36. 9:37 p.m. Evidence item number 2 drops. 9:38, 9:40 p.m. Subjugation occurs. 9:40 p.m. 9:45 p.m. Victim taken into 1427 Tasker and sustains fatal trauma. This timeline became the foundation for determining who was present or could have been present in the area during that critical 5-minute window, enabling more effective suspect vetting than the 1964 investigative process. With the 1964 timeline reconstructed and the attack window narrowed to 9:35, 9:40 p.m., the cold case unit shifted to re-evaluating suspects from the original file, starting with the individual of highest personal connection relevance. Elijah Booker. In the 1964 file, Booker was listed with an alibi that was never verified because police never contacted the sole corroborating witness, Clara Jennings, Booker's girlfriend at the time. Recognizing this as a major gap, investigator Linda Carver decided to locate Clara to determine whether she could confirm Booker's presence at her home during Mickey's disappearance window. Using old residency records, tax data, and city demographic databases, the cold case unit identified Clara Jennings, now 62, living in a southeastern Philadelphia suburb. An investigative team interviewed her in October 2006. Clara, informed of the meeting's purpose, appeared confused and surprised that the 1964 disappearance was being re-investigated, but she agreed to full cooperation and stated she still remembered that evening clearly because it was at least one of the unforgettable nights of her youth. When asked about Booker's activities on the evening of July 14, 1964, Clara said Elijah arrived at her apartment around 6:45, 7 p.m. and stayed the entire evening. They had a light snack, listened to the radio, and watched television, and she distinctly recalled that during the 9:30 p.m. local program she was watching, Elijah was still sitting in the living room. Carver asked for a detailed timeline breakdown, including whether Elijah left the apartment at any point. Clara stated definitively that Elijah did not leave during the evening because he always got complaints from my mother if he went home too late, so he usually stayed past the news before leaving. When asked when Elijah departed, Clara said around 11:10, 11:20 p.m., matching Booker's 1964 statement. To enhance credibility, Carver cross-checked 1964 television broadcast schedules and confirmed the program Clara mentioned aired at 9:30 p.m., bolstering the accuracy of her memory. The cold case unit also compared distances from Clara's home to the disappearance area. 1964 maps showed roughly 2 miles, requiring at least 25-30 minutes walking or 10 minutes by car, but Booker owned no vehicle at the time. This made Booker's presence at Tasker Street between 9:35-9:40 p.m. temporally and geographically impossible if Clara's account was accurate. Carver continued reviewing additional records to rule out memory errors. Interviews with Clara's former neighbors confirmed one who recalled frequently seeing Booker visit Clara in the evenings and never observed him leaving and returning the same night. This data did not directly prove Booker's presence in the apartment at the exact moment of Mickey's disappearance, but added logical consistency to Clara's statement and aligned with descriptions of Booker's habits during that period. When all data was aligned with the reconstructed timeline, the cold case unit concluded there was no time gap, allowing Booker to leave Clara's home, reach Tasker Street, commit the act and return between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. Booker had no vehicle, no clear motive, was not mentioned in any scene witness statements, and appeared in no physical evidence. Moreover, the team reviewed Booker's records over the subsequent 4 decades and confirmed no history of violence or criminal activity, matching the reconstructed crime pattern. Carver's final report stated, Elijah Booker has a solid alibi, corroborating witness consistent, no scene or forensic element places Booker near the victim's location, completely excluded from suspect pool. This was the first time since 1964 that Booker's alibi received proper verification, and clearing him allowed the team to focus full resources on remaining leads, particularly individuals and vehicles near Tasker Street during the victim's attack window. With Elijah Booker cleared after successful alibi verification, the cold case unit moved to reevaluate statements from 1964 witnesses, especially the only one who observed unusual movement on Mickey's route, Ray Dalton, resident of a house near the South 18th and Tasker Street entrance intersection. In the original file, Dalton's statement was recorded hastily, without cross-verification, and particularly questionable due to 1960s police interview practices where pressuring witnesses to reinforce investigative hypotheses was not uncommon. The cold case unit located Dalton in 2006. He was now 74 and living in a West Philadelphia nursing home. When Carver contacted him, Dalton expressed surprise mixed with relief. He said he had waited for a chance to set the record straight because in 1964, everything happened too fast and no one really listened. In the interview, Dalton clearly recounted what he saw on the night Mickey vanished, around 9:35 p.m., while at his back stoop taking out trash. He observed a young man passing. He believed it was Mickey, and not far behind were 2 unknown men, tall, in dark clothing, moving slowly, as if following, but trying not to attract attention. He stated this was exactly what he told police in 1964, but the original file shortened it to 2 people behind, purpose unclear, significantly diminishing its investigative value. When Carver probed further, Dalton affirmed, they weren't walking with Mickey, they were following him. This was a crucial detail, clarifying deliberate pursuit behavior by the 2 men, consistent with a targeted approach hypothesis. Carver asked whether he had ever identified the 2 men or been asked to pick from suspects police presented. Dalton sighed and said that in 1964, during a second interview with 2 officers, he felt pressured to make a clearer statement. He recounted that they repeatedly asked if he was sure Elijah Booker or Charles Hawthorne had not appeared in the area or matched the build of the 2 men he saw. Dalton said he answered no multiple times, but felt scrutinized and began doubting his own memory because they kept suggesting the killer had to be someone Mickey knew. Ultimately, when asked in a forced choice format, "Did you see Elijah Booker nearby?" he responded uncertainly, and that answer was recorded as witness does not rule out Booker's possible presence near the scene, completely misrepresenting what he intended to convey. This was clear evidence of coercive interviewing that the cold case unit sought to identify in the 1964 context of investigators seeking suspects from the victim's close circle, Dalton's statement was shaped to fit the investigative direction rather than reflect his actual observation. When Carver asked how he would describe the two men without pressure, Dalton stated clearly, "I don't know who they were. I'd never seen them before. They weren't neighbors, and definitely not Booker or Hawthorne. They were taller, walked differently, different build." He added a detail he hadn't emphasized in 1964. One of the men had an asymmetrical gait, as if his right leg was slightly stiff or less flexible. This detail was immediately noted by the cold case unit, as it provided a more specific identifying description, distinct from the generic one in the old file. This was information the original investigation never exploited. Carver continued by asking about the vehicle another witness reported nearby. Had Dalton heard or seen anything? Dalton recalled that shortly after Mickey and the two men disappeared around the alley corner, he heard a slow engine sound, but from his back stoop he had no line of sight to identify make or color. However, he believed the sound occurred not long after the three went into the darkness, a detail aligning with statements about the gray Mercury Monterey moving slowly along Tasker Street in the same time frame. Carver noted this as important corroborative data linking perpetrator movement to the suspect vehicle's appearance. At the interview's conclusion, Carver assessed that Dalton's 2006 statement was far more complete, coherent, and consistent than the abbreviated 1964 version. His affirmation that he did not identify Booker or Hawthorne, combined with a clear description of two unknown men following Mickey, helped the cold case unit determine that the original investigative direction was skewed by coercive interview methods and flawed assumptions from the outset. Carver's report concluded, Dalton's new statement reinforces the hypothesis of two unidentified perpetrators not within the victim's relationship network, with prior tailing before contact. Facts distorted in the 1964 file due to imposed interview direction must be corrected for accurate investigation. Obtaining this accurate statement opened an entirely new perspective, enabling the cold case unit to redefine the suspect profile and expand pursuit beyond individuals considered in the original investigation. With the more accurate statement from Ray Dalton confirming the presence of two unknown men following Mickey and his inability to identify anyone from those suspected in 1964, the cold case unit shifted to an investigative lead that had been completely overlooked in the original file. The gray Mercury Monterey observed by witnesses moving slowly along Tasker Street during the time frame of Mickey's disappearance. In the list of 47 Mercury Montereys registered in the area in 1964, the most prominent name was Samuel O'Neill, who lived less than 2 blocks from the alley where Mickey was approached. In 1964, police never interviewed O'Neill, leaving information about a potentially critical vehicle undeveloped from the outset. The cold case unit decided to access all records related to O'Neill's 1961 Mercury Monterey by requesting documents from the Pennsylvania Department of Motor Vehicles archives and private garages that operated in South Philadelphia at the time. Although many garages from the 1960s had closed, some paper records were preserved in the city library's collection of historic business documents. After several days of review, investigator Linda Carver discovered records from Benton's Auto Upholstery, a small shop specializing in car seat and interior repairs, which retained a 1964 invoice ledger. In that ledger, Carver found an entry dated July 21, 1964, exactly 7 days after Mickey's disappearance, with the notation, "Complete replacement of rear seat cushion. 1961 Mercury Monterey, gray owner, S. O'Neill." This detail caused the entire team to immediately halt other work and focus on the vehicle's movement and repair history. Replacing the entire rear seat was not routine maintenance, especially for a car only 3 years old at the time. Additionally, a faint and difficult-to-read note on the invoice included the words, "stains, odor," suggesting the seats had staining or an odor that could not be cleaned, necessitating full replacement. When Carver contacted the son of the original garage owner, now elderly, he stated that his father rarely replaced entire rear seats unless the customer wanted to cover something up or didn't want to explain the reason. While not legal evidence, this reinforced suspicion that O'Neill's repair was not coincidental. The cold case unit continued reviewing the Mercury's ownership history to determine the vehicle's condition around the repair date. A local insurance company record showed O'Neill purchased a new policy in June 1964, but reported no collisions in July, ruling out accident-related seat damage. This directed the team toward the possibility that someone had been restrained, struggled, or bled inside the vehicle, causing staining that required complete replacement. Carver expanded the investigation by examining addresses where O'Neill lived and worked in 1964. Property records showed he resided in a house only a 3-minute walk from 1427 Tasker, close enough to enter the abandoned house without drawing attention. Cross-referencing property ownership history, Carver uncovered a notable detail. The legal owner of 1427 Tasker, in 1964, was a man who had moved out in 1962, leaving the house vacant for 2 years before it was sealed. According to old police records, O'Neill had been noted multiple times gathering in the Tasker Street area with a group of associates, indicating familiarity with local abandoned houses. Investigators began comparing Mickey's movement timeline with O'Neill's possible movements. At the same time, the distance from O'Neill's residence to Mickey's last seen location was less than 5 minutes by car or 3 minutes on foot if avoiding notice. This placed O'Neill within range to approach the victim before 9:35 p.m. and leave the scene shortly afterward by vehicle. The more they examined, the clearer the connection between O'Neill and the case became to Carver. The Mercury's appearance in witness statements, proximity to the scene, familiarity with abandoned properties in the area, and especially the rear seat replacement invoice exactly 1 week after the disappearance. The cold case unit subjected the invoice to more technical analysis using digital magnification. They clearly read the faded phrase, "heavy staining," along with the garage's internal code for cases not cleanable with standard solutions. In 1960s auto repair terminology, this indicated possible blood or organic material causing persistent odor. Combined with forensic information that Mickey suffered severe head trauma, likely producing significant bleeding, the team began considering the hypothesis that the victim may have been transported in this very Mercury before being concealed in the wall. Another detail heightened suspicion. Despite 1964 police noting a gray Mercury Monterey at the precise time of Mickey's disappearance, no record showed they ever contacted or requested an alibi from O'Neill. From the cold case unit's perspective, this made O'Neill the first and only vehicle owner in the list with a direct temporal link to the crime window. Carver compiled a 12-page plus analysis report concluding that the unusual frequency of coincidences between Samuel O'Neill's vehicle repair, behavior, and the timeline of Mickey Harrington's disappearance places O'Neill in the position of a suspect directly linked to the scene on the night of July 14, 1964. With this new evidence, the cold case unit designated O'Neill a high-level suspect and moved the file into the phase of cross-referencing witness statements, timelines, and behavioral history to further clarify his actual role in the case. With mounting evidence linking the gray Mercury Monterey and the rear seat replacement exactly 1 week after Mickey's disappearance, the cold case unit shifted to a comprehensive review of Samuel O'Neill's behavioral history and criminal record to determine whether his pattern matched the crime profile reconstructed from forensic data. The team began by retrieving O'Neill's criminal history from the 1960s, 1970s, through the Philadelphia Police Department's old archives and Pennsylvania Court Records Center. There they discovered that O'Neill had multiple arrests between 1962 and 1974 for disorderly conduct, assault, gang-related fights, and 2 arrests for coercive behavior. Although none resulted in felony convictions, witness descriptions in the records were consistent. O'Neill was impulsive, quick to escalate to violence when challenged, and frequently used excessive force in altercations. Notably, in a 1967 incident, the victim reported that O'Neill held both my hands before punching, a behavioral pattern matching the light restraint marks on Mickey's wrists, and the hypothesis that the victim was subdued before receiving the fatal head blow. The cold case unit reviewed these events not to establish guilt, but to assess recurring behavior, and a clear pattern emerged. O'Neill had a history of using heavy force, often targeting the head and face. This aligned with forensic data. Mickey's skull showed a large fracture from direct powerful impact, likely from a blunt object or a hand-delivered blow with extreme force. Moreover, forensic technicians noted Mickey's right hand bones had a peri-mortem fracture, indicating the victim reflexively raised his hand to defend, common in sudden assaults, not accidents. Comparing the crime pattern with O'Neill's subsequent behavior, Carver noted significant overlaps: 1 capacity for impulsive yet targeted violence, 2 tendency to select low traffic areas, 3 reliance on physical strength as primary attack method, 4 strong reaction to resistance, and 5 post-incident cleanup or evidence concealment. The final point was supported by O'Neill's rear seat replacement shortly after the disappearance, an action suggesting awareness of trace evidence and intent to eliminate it. The Cold Case Unit further reviewed police data on O'Neill's presence in the Tasker Street area during the 1960s. A 1963 report noted he was warned for trespassing in an abandoned house in the same vicinity, explaining his possible knowledge of 1427 Tasker's vacant status and potential as a concealment site without immediate discovery. Community records also noted O'Neill frequently moved through the area at night, especially after work shifts or while gathering with acquaintances, aligning with Mickey's nightly walking route home. Compiling all data, Carver created a behavioral profile chart across 3 categories: violent behavior, access capability, and post-incident handling. O'Neill scored high similarity in all 3. Additionally, the adjusted timeline showed he lived within minutes travel from his residence to Mickey's attack point, fitting the perpetrator movement model. No 1964 data recorded O'Neill's activities during the disappearance window, and the initial failure to interview him created an increasingly suspicious information gap. One additional detail sharply increased suspicion. In a 1971 fight, records noted the victim described O'Neill's gait as uneven, right leg slightly stiff, an unexpected match with Ray Dalton's second statement describing one of the 2 men following Mickey as having an asymmetrical walk. Comparing this description with O'Neill's 1964 mugshot file, the Cold Case Unit noted his documented right knee injury from 1962, resulting in a slight left-leaning gait, a significant match between witness identification and physical reality. From all the above analysis, Carver concluded in an internal report, based on the pattern of violence, access to the location, connection to the abandoned house, presence of a vehicle matching witness description, and behavioral history consistent with the forensic characteristics of the case, Samuel O'Neill is currently the suspect with the highest probability of direct involvement in Mickey Harrington's death. For the first time in 4 decades, an individual was identified by the Cold Case Unit as having realistic culpability, moving the investigation from analysis to suspect-focused phase. After evaluating Samuel O'Neill's behavior and criminal history and designating him the highest probability suspect, the Cold Case Unit conducted a comprehensive re-review of all individuals considered in the original investigation to ensure no secondary or supporting role in Mickey's disappearance night was overlooked. The first person on this list was Charles Hawthorne, Mickey's co-worker at Harrington Steel, and the only individual with a documented dispute with the victim in the week prior to the incident. Although the 1964 interview indicated the conflict was minor and Hawthorne's timeline appeared non-overlapping with Mickey's disappearance, the Cold Case Unit decided on full re-evaluation for 2 reasons. 1, the original file lacked independent corroboration of Hawthorne's alibi, and 2, new forensic data indicated the crime likely involved 2 men, matching witness descriptions, making it necessary to reassess any possible involvement by Hawthorne in any capacity. Investigator Linda Carver began by reviewing 1964 personnel records at the steel mill, using surviving company archives and human resources reports. Supervisor notes confirmed Hawthorne left the mill at exactly 9 p.m. on July 14, with Mickey departing about 5 minutes later. This was consistent with Hawthorne's 1964 statement. However, the original file included no corroboration from any coworker that Hawthorne went straight home. Therefore, the Cold Case Unit decided to recontact coworkers from that shift for independent verification. Using retirement records, old personnel directories, and residency data, Carver located 4 surviving co-workers who had worked the same line that evening. 2 agreed to in-person interviews, Thomas Gillen and Robert Marks. Gillen, when asked about the evening shift of July 14, 1964, confirmed Hawthorne left on time with no unusual behavior. He recalled, they both exited via the west gate, and Hawthorne walked toward Girard Estate, under sufficient street lighting. Gillen did not recall Mickey's exact departure, but confirmed the 2 men did not leave together. This reinforced the original timeline. Mickey and Hawthorne took separate routes, with no opportunity for post-shift contact. The second witness, Robert Marks, provided additional detail. Around 9:10 p.m., while stopping at a nearby shop for cigarettes, he saw Hawthorne walking in the opposite direction from Tasker Street. Based on 1964 maps, Hawthorne's route home from the mill lay entirely outside Mickey's disappearance area, making post-shift encounter nearly impossible. Carver re-verified geographic data. Mill to Girard Estate took about 12 minutes walking, while Mill to Mickey's alley turn took 7 minutes. With Mark seeing Hawthorne at 9:10 p.m. far from Tasker Street, the cold case unit concluded Hawthorne could not have been at the attack location between 9:35 and 9:40 p.m. To complete the re-evaluation, Carver also searched for any reports or notes indicating Hawthorne frequented Tasker Street or had ties to nearby abandoned houses. No records placed him in the area or showed a history of gathering near old row houses. Hawthorne had no personal violence record. His only notation was the minor workplace dispute with Mickey. Investigators re-examined Hawthorne's 1964 statement for overlooked elements. His account and demeanor were assessed as consistent, non-defensive, non-evasive, and crucially, lacking any link to the perpetrator's behavioral pattern. He owned no vehicle, had no violence history, did not match descriptions of the asymmetrical gait of one follower, and had no reason to be in the crime area. Forensic data further widened the gap between Hawthorne and the actual perpetrator. Mickey's injuries indicated an attacker with significant strength and ability to control the victim quickly, a pattern matching O'Neill's violence record but showing no overlap with Hawthorne. Additionally, when Carver sought secondary witnesses at the mill to determine whether Hawthorne displayed unusual behavior after Mickey's disappearance, interviewees confirmed he continued normal attendance, showed no anxiety, and only asked general questions about the disappearance, like everyone else. This contrasted with typical offender behavior patterns of anxiety or habit changes in the days following a crime. The cold case unit also reviewed Hawthorne's post-1964 life records and found no signs of violent behavior or criminal tendencies. All this led to Carver's report conclusion: no forensic behavioral or temporal evidence links Charles Hawthorne to Mickey Harrington's death. His timeline aligns with the 1964 statement, and independent witness data confirms he was not in the crime area. Hawthorne is cleared from the suspect pool. With the re-evaluation complete and no elements tying Hawthorne to the case, the cold case unit officially closed the investigative direction related to this coworker, narrowing the suspect's scope and allowing full focus on remaining leads, particularly those connected to Samuel O'Neill and the crime pattern reconstructed from forensics and the 1964 timeline. The cold case unit, after clearing Charles Hawthorne and narrowing focus to data related to the 2 unknown men described by witness Ray Dalton, continued reviewing community information sources to identify individuals who may have witnessed events but were never interviewed in 1964. Part of the reinvestigation strategy involved re-examining resident lists near Tasker Street at the time and tracking those who had moved away, as many old cases stalled simply because potential witnesses were never asked or not asked at the right moment. During this review, investigator Linda Carver discovered a loose note in a 1965 neighborhood management file mentioning a man named Harold Vance, resident of the house directly behind 1427 Tasker Street, who had filed a repair request for his back door due to lock tampering or external interference. This note had never been linked to Mickey's disappearance, but the timing, filed just 3 weeks after the disappearance night, made it a valuable lead to the cold case unit. Tracing the address records, the team determined that Harold Vance, now 81, was living with his son in New Jersey. Carver and another investigator met him for an interview. Vance was initially very guarded, not understanding why events from over 4 decades earlier were resurfacing, but when explained that Mickey's remains had been found in the wall of the adjacent house and the case was under re-investigation, he gradually agreed to cooperate. When asked about events in the summer of 1964, Vance affirmed that on one night in July, he could not recall the exact date but described weather matching the week of Mickey's disappearance. He heard unusual noises behind the abandoned house, including hurried footsteps and a sound like something heavy hitting the wall. He estimated the time around 9:40 p.m., when he typically went to the back to check his tool shed lock because strangers occasionally passed through the area. While standing in his rear yard, Vance looked through a gap in the wooden fence, separating his property from 1427 Tasker. Lighting was very dim, but he saw 2 tall, broad-shouldered figures dragging a third person through the back door of the abandoned house. Vance described the person being dragged as unable to walk, almost lifted from both sides, with the head tilted to one side and arms limp, details matching Mickey's hand injury and forensic evidence of restraint. Most notably, Vance had never reported this to police in 1964. When Carver asked why, Vance admitted he didn't want to get involved because the area frequently had troublesome youth groups and he feared retaliation if they realized he had seen something. He also did not know a young man's disappearance in the neighborhood had occurred the same night, as information had not yet spread widely. Carver asked for the most detailed description possible of the 2 men. Vance stated, both wore dark clothing. One was noticeably taller by a few inches, and particularly, one had an uneven gait, stepping unevenly while moving. A detail strikingly matching Ray Dalton's description of one of the 2 men, following Mickey, having an asymmetrical walk. This data, when cross-referenced with O'Neill's documented right knee injury from 1962 and witness descriptions from the 1970s, noting O'Neill's uneven gait, created a significant previously undiscovered connection. Vance also recalled that when the 2 men pulled the victim inside, he heard the back door of 1427 Tasker slam hard against the frame, as if it was rarely used. This aligned with the subsequent wall reconstruction, indicating the perpetrator used the rear entrance to avoid visibility from the main street and carried out body concealment quietly. Carver immediately compared this with the forensic timeline. Vance heard noises and saw 3 figures right around 9:35, 9:40 p.m., precisely the reconstructed attack window. The description of the victim being pulled into the house matched the hypothesis that Mickey was subdued at evidence item number 2's location and forced toward 1427 Tasker within seconds of the attack. Most importantly, Vance's new statement reinforced Dalton's assertion that the perpetrators were 2 individuals, not a lone act. Neither Hawthorne, Booker, nor others considered in the original investigation had data indicating pair activity or connection to patterns of 2 people dragging a victim into a concealed space. In contrast, community records on O'Neill noted his frequent nighttime gatherings with a group of 2 or 3 others, often in abandoned houses, further concentrating the investigation on him and any possible accomplice. Carver's report conclusion for the re-interview witness section stated, Harold Vance's statement not only confirms the 2 perpetrator model, but provides the first direct eyewitness account of the victim being taken into 1427 Tasker within the forensic time frame. This fully aligns with the reconstructed timeline and Ray Dalton's statement, forming the most consistent witness evidence chain ever present in the case file. With this new lead, the cold case unit for the first time obtained a direct description of the action of dragging the victim into the house where the remains were found, opening a deeper investigative phase aimed at identifying the 2 perpetrators, appearing in both witnesses' accounts. When Harold Vance's supplemental statement confirmed the 2 perpetrator model and the behavior of dragging the victim into the house at 1427 Tasker, the cold case unit conducted a comprehensive review of all data related to individuals who had been active in the area with Samuel O'Neill. This included people documented in community records, police reports, and youth groups from that period. While retracing O'Neill's old acquaintances, investigator Linda Carver discovered a noteworthy detail in hospital records. Charles Hawthorne, the coworker questioned in 1964 and recently cleared as a suspect due to a mismatched timeline, had been admitted for end-stage heart disease to a long-term care facility in late 2005 and passed away in early 2006. What caught Carver's attention was not Hawthorne's death itself, but an additional hospital note stating that 3 weeks before his passing, Hawthorne had requested to speak with a local pastor, a request that typically arises only when a patient feels the need to unburden something before death. The cold case unit located Pastor James Ellery, who had visited Hawthorne in his final days. When asked whether Hawthorne had mentioned anything related to the 1964 disappearance, the pastor initially declined to disclose details on ethical grounds. However, after being informed that this was a homicide investigation and that Hawthorne's account could be key to verifying the truth, he agreed to share portions that were not protected as religious confidences. According to Pastor Ellery, Hawthorne engaged in a nearly hour-long conversation in which he stated that he had lived 4 decades with a secret too heavy. Hawthorne admitted that on the night Mickey Harrington disappeared, he was with Samuel O'Neill, but according to his account, Hawthorne himself was not the one who delivered the fatal blow, but only contributed to the chain of events that became irreversible. Hawthorne stated that that night, after leaving the shop, he did not go straight home as he had claimed in 1964. Instead, he detoured to meet O'Neill, and the two walked along Tasker Street, looking for their usual hangout spot. When they spotted Mickey walking alone under dim streetlights, O'Neill remarked that the boy looked easy to intimidate and approached him proactively. Hawthorne described that he initially thought it was just the usual scare tactics the group of youths often used to show off, but O'Neill went further, forcing Mickey against the wall in the dark stretch between the alley and Tasker. When Mickey resisted, O'Neill applied significantly greater force to subdue him. Hawthorne admitted that, at O'Neill's request, he held both of Mickey's hands for a few seconds, believing O'Neill only intended to warn the boy and never imagining the situation would escalate. However, O'Neill then delivered an extremely powerful blow to Mickey's temple, a detail that perfectly matched the skull fracture confirmed by forensics. Hawthorne said the strike caused Mickey to collapse immediately, virtually unresponsive. Panicked because events had spiraled beyond control, Hawthorne asked O'Neill what to do next, but O'Neill, who never left traces, decided to drag Mickey into a nearby abandoned house to check if he was still alive. Hawthorne admitted to helping O'Neill pull Mickey through the back door of 1427 Tasker, a detail that exactly matched Harold Vance's account of 2 figures dragging a third person inside via the rear yard. Once inside, according to Hawthorne, Mickey was nearly unconscious. O'Neill checked for breathing, but then declared, "He's dead." Hawthorne recounted that it was at that moment he realized their initial actions had become an irreparable crime. O'Neill then asked Hawthorne to help one last time by finding something to conceal the body, and it was O'Neill who suggested bricking him up in the wall, since the abandoned house already had a pre-existing recessed section in the wall from prior repairs. Hawthorne accurately described the wall recess location on the west side of the living room, behind bricks that are darker than the rest, a detail that matched precisely with the location where the body was found in 2006. This level of specificity ruled out guesswork, as the detail had never been publicly released. Hawthorne also stated that O'Neill was the one who carried out the walling up, while he stood guard at the door. When Pastor Ellery asked why he had not come forward in 1964, Hawthorne explained that he feared O'Neill's retaliation, since O'Neill knew where he and his family lived, and had once threatened to take care of the whole family if he ever talked. Moreover, when he saw police focusing suspicion on Booker and others, Hawthorne stayed silent, thinking maybe it would all just fade away. The pastor confirmed that Hawthorne mentioned O'Neill's name at least 3 times during the confession, describing O'Neill as someone who lost control when angry and was always the hardest hitter in the group. Hawthorne insisted he deserved punishment, but hoped the truth would come out after his death. At the end of the conversation, he gave one directive the cold case unit considered absolutely reliable: the precise location where the body was hidden. He said, "If someone breaks the wall exactly where I'm telling you, they'll find him." In fact, just a few months after this confession, the demolition team located Mickey's remains exactly at the spot Hawthorne described. In her report, Carver noted, Charles Hawthorne's deathbed confession aligns completely with forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the crime scene structure. The data confirm Hawthorne's role in restraining the victim, while establishing Samuel O'Neill as the one who delivered the fatal blow and orchestrated the body concealment. This was the final piece proving the two-perpetrator model was accurate and that O'Neill played the central role in Mickey Harrington's death. After receiving the full contents of Charles Hawthorne's deathbed confession from Pastor Ellery, the cold case unit proceeded to the most critical step, cross-referencing every detail in the confession against existing forensic data to determine the degree of match and assess the statement's credibility. Investigator Linda Carver and the forensics team divided the confession into three main data categories: one, mechanism of death and wound characteristics; two, signs of restraint prior to death; three, body concealment process and crime scene structure. Each category was compared in detail with forensic findings from the skeletal examination, the 1427 Tasker crime scene results, and the witness-based timeline. In the first analysis group, Hawthorne stated that O'Neill's blow to Mickey's temple was so forceful it knocked him down instantly, and was delivered barehanded with extreme power. Forensics confirmed that the victim's skull had a long fracture running from the left temple across the forehead, exactly matching the location Hawthorne described, and the distinctive curved fracture pattern occurs only from direct, concentrated, angled impact from above. This ruled out accidental fall or incidental impact, and confirmed that the fatal injury was intentional and violent, precisely as Hawthorne described O'Neill carrying it out. Additionally, the right-hand fracture identified by forensics was a perimortem injury consistent with Mickey instinctively raising his hand to block the blow, a detail Hawthorne could not have known unless he was actually present. In the second data group, Hawthorne admitted to holding Mickey's hands behind his back for a few seconds at O'Neill's request to prevent resistance. Forensics noted shallow compression grooves around the wrists, consistent with restraint by soft cord or human hand grip. Notably, the grooves were not as deep as those caused by thick rope, but matched the pattern Hawthorne described, restraint by physical force rather than tools. This was an extremely significant detail, as such injury patterns rarely align perfectly with a statement, unless the statement accurately reflects what occurred. The forensics team confirmed that the depth and distribution of the wrist grooves matched Hawthorne's description perfectly in both force direction and brief duration of restraint. In the third analysis group, body concealment and crime scene structure, Hawthorne's confession demonstrated a level of specific knowledge only someone present at the event could possess. He described the wall recess on the west side of the living room, behind bricks darker than the rest, and noted the house already had a pre-existing indentation that required removing only a few bricks to access the cavity. When the demolition team discovered the remains in 2006, they recorded exactly this: the west side bricks were darker, the mortar was newer, and the wall had a hollow cavity sized to contain a human body. Moreover, the added bricks did not match the rest of the house's construction, indicating they were built after 1964, consistent with Hawthorne's account that O'Neill walled it up afterward. Crime scene forensics also found fragments of decayed fabric and small metal pieces beneath the skeleton, consistent with Hawthorne's description that O'Neill positioned Mickey leaning against the wall, head tilted, body secured with available cloth or materials inside the house. Mortar samples from the rebuilt section dated to the late 1960s, reinforcing the accuracy of Hawthorne's information. Continuing cross-referencing with the timeline and witness statements, Hawthorne placed the incident between approximately 9:35, 9:40 p.m., exactly matching the forensic reconstruction based on the two dropped items along the route, and Ray Dalton's account. Additionally, Hawthorne's description of dragging Mickey through the back door matched witness Harold Vance, the only person who saw three figures moving toward the rear of the house during that exact time window. One particularly crucial match noted in the report, Hawthorne described O'Neill's gait as uneven due to a right knee injury, which aligned with Dalton's description of one of the two men following Mickey having a slight limp, and matched O'Neill's 1962 medical records. When Carver synthesized the entire analysis, she concluded, No detail in the confession contradicted the forensic evidence. On the contrary, every key detail matched perfectly and even gave meaning to previously unexplained traces. This transformed Hawthorne's confession into a highly credible piece of evidence, strongly supporting the conclusion that Samuel O'Neill delivered the fatal head injury leading to Mickey's death and directed the concealment of the body. The cold case unit report concluded, forensics fully corroborate the mechanism of death, restraint marks, and criminal conduct as described in Hawthorne's statement. The points of alignment between forensics and the confession achieve a very high degree of consistency, reinforcing the conclusion that O'Neill was the direct perpetrator of the death and leader of the body-hiding process. Hawthorne played the role of an accessory providing support during the victim restraint phase. This formed a critical legal foundation for proceeding to the next step in pursuing criminal accountability after 42 years buried inside a brick wall of an abandoned house. After completing the forensic cross-referencing and confirming that Hawthorne's confession was fully compatible with physical evidence, the cold case unit entered the pivotal phase, compiling the entire case file to construct a seamless, comprehensive investigative conclusion capable of withstanding 2006 legal standards. This task included reconstructing the timeline from the moment Mickey left Rossi's Market until the body's discovery, determining each individual's role, and eliminating all previously considered suspects inconsistent with the new facts. Carver began by rebuilding the complete timeline. 9:32 p.m. Mickey leaves Rossi's Market. 9:35 p.m. Item #1 dropped, indicating a slight disruption in movement. 9:36. 9:37 p.m. Item #2 dropped near 1427 Tasker, matching the point where restraint began. 9:35. 9:40 p.m. Per forensics and witnesses, Dalton, Vance, two men approach, attack, and drag the victim into the abandoned house. 9:40. 9:45 p.m. Per Hawthorne's confession, Samuel O'Neill delivers the fatal blow, and the victim dies almost immediately afterward. After 9:45 p.m., the body is placed in the wall recess and sealed with new bricks. The next phase was assigning roles based on evidence, witness statements, and forensics. Carver organized the data into three groups: directly involved, potential support, and unrelated. In the directly involved group, only Samuel O'Neill and Charles Hawthorne remained. O'Neill was identified as the one who initiated contact with the victim, delivered the fatal blow, moved the victim into the house, and directed the concealment. Indirect evidence, including the rear seat replacement receipt, the uneven gait description, and familiarity with abandoned properties, further solidified O'Neill's central role throughout the crime. Hawthorne, through his deathbed confession and forensic corroboration, was identified as an accessory who restrained the victim for a few seconds and assisted O'Neill in moving Mickey inside. Forensic analysis showed restraint marks consistent with handheld physical force and not inconsistent with injury data. In the second group, potential but not directly involved support, no individuals were identified, as all evidence indicated only two perpetrators, matching Dalton's and Vance's statements. The third group, unrelated, included suspects considered in the original investigation, but incompatible with new evidence. Elijah Booker was fully cleared after his alibi was verified by highly credible witness, Clara Jennings. No forensic or witness data placed him near the scene. Charles Hawthorne had previously been suspected due to personal conflicts, but independent timelines from co-workers, Gillen and Marks, proved he left the area in a different direction at the time of the attack. His later confession clarified that he only met O'Neill after work, showing his original statement's discrepancy stemmed from fear of implication. Numerous other names from 1964 files, such as local residents, had no connection to the two-perpetrator model. Carver officially eliminated the entire 1964 suspect list as lacking investigative value under modern standards. Additionally, the cold case unit ruled out all possibilities of accident, natural causes, or voluntary disappearance. Forensics confirmed the injury could not be self-inflicted. Restraint marks showed the victim did not vanish by chance. The body's location proved deliberate, immediate concealment after death. All data were integrated into a comprehensive summary exceeding 100 pages, in which Carver detailed each investigative phase, items dropped along the route, witness statements from Dalton and Vance, O'Neill's rear seat repair records, O'Neill's prior violent history, forensics confirming the death mechanism, and Hawthorne's final confession. This compilation led to a single conclusion: the 1964 Mickey Harrington case was an intentional homicide perpetrated by Samuel O'Neill, with assistance from Charles Hawthorne, who later cooperated in concealing the body out of fear of O'Neill's retaliation. With all unrelated suspects eliminated and a legally consistent chain of conduct established, the Cold Case Unit formally completed the prosecution recommendation file for O'Neill, closing the review phase with a clear resolution after more than 40 years of mystery enveloping South Philadelphia. With a complete investigative summary and the entire chain of legal evidence pointing directly to Samuel O'Neill, the Cold Case Unit moved into the critical phase of preparing the suspect's arrest after more than 4 decades buried. According to the most recent residency records, O'Neill, now 64, had left Philadelphia in the late 1980s and was currently living in Camden, New Jersey. Although elderly and no longer involved in gang activity, he was still assessed as potentially resistant based on his long history of violent behavior. Therefore, the Cold Case Unit developed a multi-layered surveillance plan to establish O'Neill's routines before executing the arrest. Over 2 weeks, a covert investigative team coordinated with Camden police conducted continuous surveillance. They noted that O'Neill lived in a first-floor apartment in an old 3-story building without modern security systems. Each morning, he walked 3 blocks to a corner grocery store and occasionally drove his old sedan to an auto shop where he worked part-time repairs. No unusual signs were observed, no meetings with strangers, route changes, or excessive caution, which indicated the arrest could proceed safely, but still required care, given O'Neill's history of strong reactions to direct confrontation. Once surveillance was complete, the Philadelphia District Attorney formally submitted an arrest warrant application to federal court, as the homicide occurred in Pennsylvania, but the suspect resided in another state. The warrant was approved on 3 primary grounds: 1, irrefutable forensic evidence; 2, Hawthorne's deathbed confession, fully matching the scene; and 3, an independent witness chain, placing the suspect near the crime area at the exact time of the attack. Upon approval, the Cold Case Unit transferred the file to New Jersey task forces for coordinated execution. The arrest was scheduled for Tuesday morning, when O'Neill would have just left home, but not yet reached work, minimizing public exposure risk. At 6:15 a.m., 6 agents approached the apartment building from 2 directions, one team covering the front door, the other blocking the rear exit. As O'Neill opened the door to step out, the task force immediately moved in, read the arrest warrant, and ordered him to place his hands behind his head. O'Neill appeared visibly shocked and panicked, repeatedly asking, "What is this about?" but offered no resistance. He was handcuffed and placed in a vehicle within less than a minute. Upon hearing the murder charge related to the 1964 incident, O'Neill merely shook his head, neither confirming nor denying, and remained silent per advice from the assigned public defender. After the arrest, investigators executed a search warrant on O'Neill's apartment to seize documents, items, or any records related to his Philadelphia past. Among the items examined, they found an old metal box containing personal papers from the 1960s, 70s, including youthful photos of O'Neill, a 1961 Mercury Monterey vehicle registration, unrelated auto repair receipts, and a small notebook listing abandoned houses in South Philadelphia, locations O'Neill frequented with his group. Of particular note was a corner-torn loose sheet listing 3 addresses, 1419, 1423, and 1427 Tasker Street, marked empty, unoccupied. This was highly significant, indirect evidence. It proved O'Neill had scouted and recorded abandoned houses around the victim's disappearance area, fully consistent with the crime pattern and Hawthorne's confession. Additionally, inside the apartment, investigators found a small piece of mortar kept in a keepsake box. When tested, its color and composition were consistent with mortar samples from the rebuilt wall at 1427 Tasker, though absolute sourcing could not be confirmed due to the passage of time. Nevertheless, O'Neill's retention of this mortar fragment further heightened suspicion of his direct involvement in walling up the victim. After seizing all documents and evidence, the scene report was immediately forwarded to Philadelphia. The DA and cold case unit agreed that the evidence collected in New Jersey strongly bolstered the prosecution file, particularly the abandoned house list and preserved Mercury registration. That same afternoon, O'Neill was transported back to Philadelphia under agent escort, prepared to face formal charges after more than 40 years evading accountability for a case once buried behind the brick wall of 1427 Tasker Street. With Samuel O'Neill having been arrested and all newly collected evidence brought back to Philadelphia, the cold case unit and the district attorney's office entered the critical phase, preparing the official prosecution file, a process that required organizing, categorizing, and evaluating the entire body of evidence to ensure the court would have a complete, coherent, and irrefutable picture of the crime that occurred in 1964. The DA decided to divide the evidence into 4 major categories in accordance with modern prosecution standards. 1 forensic evidence, 2 witness testimony, 3 documents related to the vehicle and vehicle repair behavior, 4 Charles Hawthorne's deathbed confession. Each evidence group was assessed for reliability, independence, and mutual corroboration. In the first group, forensics served as the foundation, the body's location in the wall recess, the fatal skull fracture, wrist compression marks consistent with victim restraint, the perimortem hand fracture from defensive reflex, and bone degradation data confirming the time of death aligned with 1964. The forensic conclusion affirmed that Mickey was killed by intentional, forceful impact, and the body was deliberately concealed, ruling out any accident or voluntary disappearance theories. In the second group, witness statements, re-recorded after 4 decades, demonstrated remarkable consistency. Ray Dalton saw 2 men following Mickey. Harold Vance observed 2 men dragging a third person into 1427 Tasker, and both accounts matched the forensic timeline and the description of one perpetrator's uneven gait, a detail that aligned with O'Neill's right knee injury. This group provided direct, on-scene observations, made especially valuable because none of these witnesses knew the forensic details or the confession, enhancing the independence of the data. The third group encompassed all documentation related to the 1961 Mercury Monterey, O'Neill's 1964 vehicle registration, the July 21, 1964 rear seat replacement invoice, noting heavy staining, odor, and garage records, showing the seat was fully replaced rather than patched. The DA viewed the rear seat replacement, occurring just 1 week after the disappearance, as evidence of trace concealment. Combined with forensics confirming head bleeding, the vehicle documents became significant circumstantial evidence. Additionally, the notebook recovered from O'Neill's home, listing abandoned houses and specifically noting 1427 Tasker, empty, was evaluated as corroborating preparatory or scouting behavior in the crime area. The fourth group was the linchpin of the entire file, Charles Hawthorne's deathbed confession, which accurately described the mechanism of death, body concealment location, approach to the victim, and Samuel O'Neill's role. This statement was corroborated detail by forensics and independent witnesses, leading the DA to regard it as circumstantial evidence carrying the weight of direct evidence, especially because Hawthorne's descriptions of the wall structure and hiding spot exactly matched the location where the remains were found, details never publicly disclosed. After categorization, the DA proceeded to the next step, charging under Pennsylvania state law. Based on the case's nature, 3 serious charges were identified. 1 kidnapping, because Mickey was forcibly restrained and dragged into 1427 Tasker against his will. 2 murder in the second degree, applicable to an intentional killing, resulting from a deliberate attack without premeditation. 3 abuse of corpse concealment of a body, because O'Neill directly directed the concealment of the body in the wall recess and the rebuilding of the wall to erase evidence. These 3 charges were deemed the most appropriate fit for the sequence of events, with murder 2 as the core charge, because forensics confirmed an immediately fatal forceful blow, and Hawthorne's confession indicated O'Neill acted with intentional violence, not in self-defense or by accident. To ensure a complete court-ready file, Carver and the DA drafted more than 350 pages of reports, including detailed forensic analysis, cross-reference timelines, 1964 crime scene maps, 2006 interview transcripts of Dalton and Vance, the pastor Ellery's recorded confession excerpts, vehicle documents, and repair invoices, O'Neill's history of violence, and behavioral analysis matching the crime pattern. A separate case theory summary was prepared, illustrating how the evidence groups interconnected forensics witness statement, physical evidence, confession, concealment motive. The DA also requested that the forensic expert and the two lead investigators prepare to testify in court to clarify the links between the blow, restraint marks, and the dragging of the victim into the house. Ultimately, the entire file was compiled into the official docket, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Samuel O'Neill, submitted to the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, Criminal Division, marking the transition from investigation to criminal prosecution after more than 40 years of justice buried inside the wall of an abandoned house. The trial of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Samuel O'Neill officially opened in December 2006, drawing special attention because the case involved a death more than 40 years earlier and rested on a combination of modern forensics, newly obtained witness testimony, and a co-perpetrator's deathbed confession. The trial lasted 8 days, beginning with the prosecution's opening statement, which built the entire argument around the four-tiered evidence structure prepared by the DA. In the forensic presentation, the medical examiner detailed Mickey Harrington's cause of death, a large left temporal skull fracture causing acute brain injury, perfectly consistent with a powerful bare-handed or blunt object blow, as described in Hawthorne's confession. The trial lasted 8 days, beginning with the prosecution's opening statement, which built the entire argument around the four-tiered evidence structure prepared by the DA. In the forensic presentation, the medical examiner detailed Mickey Harrington's cause of death, a large left temporal skull fracture causing acute brain injury, perfectly consistent with a powerful bare-handed or blunt object blow, as described in Hawthorne's confession. They displayed X-ray images, skull reconstruction diagrams, and scientific analysis of the strike angle, affirming the force required indicated a physically strong individual, consistent with O'Neill's documented violent behavior. Forensics also presented wrist compression marks proving restraint prior to death, and the hand fracture showing the victim raised his hand in reflexive defense, evidence demonstrating the death was not accidental, but a direct assault. Next, the prosecution introduced crime scene evidence, photographs of the wall recess containing the body, mortar analysis reports, rebuilt brick samples, and the body's position exactly matching Hawthorne's description. They also entered as evidence the victim's steel mill keychain, found directly at the remains location, further confirming identity. In the witness testimony portion, the prosecution called Ray Dalton and Harold Vance, two independent observers who described the perpetrator's movements on the night of the crime. Dalton confirmed seeing two men following Mickey just before the victim vanished. Vance detailed two men dragging a third person through the back door of 1427 Tasker during the precise time frame indicated by forensics. Both testimonies showed high consistency, no contradictions, and alignment with the modernly reconstructed timeline. When presenting Charles Hawthorne's deathbed confession, the prosecution called Pastor Ellery to testify. He read the admissible portions of Hawthorne's account, O'Neill as the attacker, the fatal blow, dragging the victim into the house, and Hawthorne's own role in holding the victim's hands. The prosecution emphasized that the confession contained details impossible to know without being present, particularly the precise hiding location and the darker wall bricks, elements fully verified by forensics. In the defense phase, O'Neill's attorney focused on challenging the confession's reliability because it was relayed indirectly through a pastor. They argued the pastor's memory could be flawed, and there was no audio recording or direct written statement from Hawthorne. However, the prosecution countered by pointing out that forensics, witnesses, and independent documents corroborated every point in the confession, making inaccuracy highly improbable. The defense also attacked the strength of the forensics, noting no DNA or fingerprints of O'Neill at the scene, but the prosecution responded that, after more than 40 years walled up, DNA recovery was impossible. yet the mechanical bone marks and other physical evidence sufficiently established the crime. When the defense suggested Hawthorne could have delivered the fatal blow, the prosecution immediately presented 1964 medical and physical records showing Hawthorne lacked the strength for such an injury mechanism, while O'Neill had a documented history of using severe force in multiple assaults during the same period. Finally, the defense attempted to downplay the Mercury Monterey as direct evidence, but the prosecution introduced the rear seat replacement invoice with the heavy staining odor note, dated to the week of the crime, along with the abandoned house list, including 1427 Tasker, empty, reinforcing O'Neill's preparation and concealment behavior. After 8 days of trial, the jury entered deliberations. They reviewed the 4 evidence groups: forensics, proving intentional criminal conduct; independent witnesses, describing 2 perpetrators; documents on the Mercury and trace concealment; and the confession perfectly matching physical data. Deliberations lasted nearly 6 hours, not unusually long for a 40-year-old case, because, as one juror later stated, the pieces fit together too perfectly. Upon returning to the courtroom, the jury announced unanimous agreement on all 3 charges. Based on the jury's verdict and the full body of presented evidence, Samuel O'Neill was found guilty of murder in the 2nd degree, kidnapping, and concealment of a body. The judge emphasized that the case did not rest solely on a deceased person's confession, but on an independent, interlocking, irrefutable chain of evidence encompassing forensics, witnesses, and historical documents. O'Neill, standing before the court, merely bowed his head in silence when invited to speak. At sentencing, the judge considered the passage of time and the defendant's age, but stressed that time does not diminish the gravity of the crime. Ultimately, the court imposed 40 years imprisonment, the maximum possible for murder 2 under Pennsylvania law, as applicable to a 1964 offense. Given that O'Neill was 64 at the time of trial, this sentence was effectively equivalent to life imprisonment. After sentencing, the judge devoted a special segment to clarifying the fate of a name wrongly suspected for 4 decades: Elijah Booker. Based on the verified alibi, new witness statements, and the complete absence of any forensic or circumstantial link to the crime, the court formally declared Booker cleared of all suspicion in the 1964 police records. Simultaneously, the DA issued a formal request to amend internal files, ensuring Booker was removed from any investigative suspect list. This was the first time Booker, who had carried the stigma of wrongful suspicion for decades, received official vindication from the justice system he had lost faith in. Immediately following the trial, the Cold Case Unit held a press conference to release the final investigative conclusion report, a critical document exceeding 180 pages. It not only explained how the case was solved after 4 decades, but also analyzed why resolution was impossible in 1964. The report identified 4 major investigative failures in the original inquiry. 1 failure to examine the wall at 1427 Tasker. Despite noted disturbances, 2 failure to verify Booker's alibi and interview the Mercury owner, despite scene data requiring it. 3 interrogation pressure that caused Dalton's statement to be misrecorded, leading to investigative misdirection, and 4 failure to consider a 2-perpetrator model, despite at least 2 independent statements mentioning 2 figures. The Cold Case Unit report stressed that these errors were not merely individual oversights, but products of the era's investigative standards, lacking modern forensics, standardized alibi verification procedures, and guidelines for handling uncertain witnesses. From these failures, the unit issued 5 reform recommendations. First, all missing person cases must be treated as potential criminal matters within the first 24 hours, rather than waiting for voluntary return. Second, investigators must cross-verify all alibis, even absent clear suspicion. Third, all witness statements must be audio recorded and preserved in original form to prevent alteration or misinterpretation. Fourth, any disturbed physical evidence must be directly examined rather than dismissed on subjective assumption. Fifth, databases of abandoned properties and high-risk locations must be continuously updated to support behavioral pattern analysis. The final section of the report assessed the case's impact on Philadelphia's investigative community. The Mickey Harrington case became a textbook example demonstrating the value of modern forensics re-interviewing witnesses, and reopening closed cases lacking a body. Following this case, the Philadelphia Police Department formally established a larger-scale cold case unit with dedicated funding and technology to address long-dormant investigations. The case also exerted pressure on the legal system to improve evidence storage and statement documentation practices. As the judge left the bench and O'Neill was led out of the courtroom, the Harrington family finally heard the words they had waited 42 years to hear: justice, though delayed, had been served. The cold case unit concluded in its report, if the 1964 investigation had not overlooked the smallest details, justice might have arrived sooner, but correcting those mistakes today ensures they will not be repeated in the future. The story of the Mickey Harrington case, a young man who vanished in 1964 and only received justice more than 40 years later, clearly reflects the issues America still faces today: investigative bias, workload pressure causing police to miss details, the fragility of witness testimony, and the importance of transparency in the justice system. The 1964 police overlooking the wall at 1427 Tasker, despite disturbance signs, failing to verify Elijah Booker's alibi, and never interviewing Samuel O'Neill, the Mercury owner present at the critical time, show how a single wrong decision or minor prejudice can produce consequences lasting decades. In modern life, with information overload and constant work pressure, the story reminds us that meticulous attention to detail remains the foundation of every correct decision, whether in investigations, office work, or social interactions. The misrecording of Ray Dalton's statement under interrogation pressure recalls a reality: people are easily influenced by environment and authority. This is a powerful reminder that in life, especially in America, where diversity and differing viewpoints are vast, we must create spaces where people can speak truthfully without fear of judgment or pressure. Elijah Booker's 4-decade wrongful suspicion also teaches a vital lesson about prejudice. Once society wrongly labels someone, the innocent person bears the suffering. For Americans today, this serves as a warning against hasty judgment from social media to real life. Finally, the cold case unit's persistence shows that justice arrives only when people refuse to give up. In personal life, this lesson translates to never abandoning what is right, no matter how long the journey. If you are interested in journeys seeking justice like the Mickey Harrington case, please subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore how truth is revealed even after being buried for decades.